You've been lied to about love. They told you attachment is passion, loyalty, deep care, and proof that someone truly matters to you. But if that were true, why does it hurt so much? Why does closeness so often bring anxiety? Why do you feel afraid the moment someone changes their tone, pulls away, goes silent, or becomes harder to reach? The truth is, what you call attachment is not always love. Sometimes it is fear. Fear of being forgotten, fear of being replaced, fear of being left behind. And Buddhist wisdom reveals this with brutal clarity. For centuries, the deepest teachings have shown that suffering begins the moment the mind clings, the moment it says mine, the moment it tries to hold tightly to what was never meant to stay fixed. Tonight, as you listen to these lessons, something will begin to shift. Your mind will grow quieter. Your chest will feel lighter. The panic beneath your need for reassurance will start to reveal itself, and what once felt like love may finally be seen for what it really is, a wound asking not to be abandoned again. This is not just another talk to fall asleep to. This is a mirror for the part of you that is still afraid to be left behind. Are you ready? Let's begin. And as that realization begins to settle, something uncomfortable but honest starts to rise. Because if attachment is not love, then what have you really been holding on to all this time? A quiet tension begins to reveal itself, the kind that has always been there but rarely questioned. The kind that shows up in small reactions, in subtle fears, in the need for reassurance that never seems to last. And the deeper you look, the clearer it becomes that what felt like connection may have been something much more fragile. There is a difference, a very subtle one, between loving someone and holding on to them. Most people never see it, and because of that, they suffer in ways they cannot explain. And this is where everything begins to change. There is a kind of care that feels light, almost effortless, like holding something gently without the need to tighten your grip. It does not rush, it does not demand, it does not constantly check if it is still safe. It simply exists, steady and open, without fear of losing itself. This is what genuine love feels like when it is not mixed with hidden tension. But then there is another kind, one that looks similar on the surface, but feels very different underneath. It is restless, always searching for signs, always trying to confirm that everything is still okay. It notices delays, changes in tone, shifts in attention. It reads into silence. It creates stories where there may be none. And no matter how much it receives, it never fully relaxes. This is clinging. Clinging does not begin as something obvious. It does not announce itself as fear. It presents itself as care, as concern, as deep emotional investment. It says, I just want to be close, but behind that, there is a quieter voice saying, I need you to stay the same. And that is where the difference begins to show. Love allows change. Clinging resists it. When someone truly cares, there is an understanding that the other person is not an object to hold on to. They are a living, changing being with their own thoughts, their own emotions, their own path. Genuine care respects that movement. It does not try to control it. It does not feel threatened by it. It stays present without needing to secure anything. But clinging does the opposite. It tries to freeze moments. It tries to hold on to how things felt at their peak. It becomes attached to certain behaviors, certain levels of attention, certain ways of being treated. And when those things shift, even slightly, it reacts. Not always outwardly, but inwardly. A tightening in the chest, a sudden wave of unease, a need to fix something that may not even be broken. This is not because love is unstable. It is because clinging is built on fear. And fear always looks for something to hold. The mind, in its attempt to feel safe, begins to attach itself not just to the person, but to what the person provides. The feeling of being seen, the comfort of being chosen, the reassurance of not being alone. These things become tied to one source, and slowly, without realizing it, dependence begins to form. At first it feels beautiful. The closeness feels intense. The connection feels meaningful. There is a sense of importance, a feeling that this bond matters deeply. But underneath that intensity, something else is growing. A quiet expectation. An expectation that the other person will continue to meet those emotional needs in the same way, at the same level, without interruption. And when that expectation is not met, even for a moment, discomfort appears. This is where clinging reveals itself. Because love does not break when something small changes. Clinging does. Love does not need constant proof. Clinging does. Love does not feel threatened by distance. Clinging does. And the reason is simple. Love comes from a place of inner fullness. Clinging comes from a place of inner lack. When there is a sense of wholeness within, connection becomes something to share, not something to depend on. There is no pressure for the other person to complete anything because nothing feels incomplete. There is space, there is patience, there is trust. But when there is an inner emptiness, connection becomes something else entirely. It becomes a way to fill that space. And once something is used to fill a void, losing it feels unbearable. This is why clinging feels so strong. It is not just about the person, it is about what the person represents. They become a source of stability, a mirror that reflects worth, a presence that quiets inner discomfort. And when that source feels unstable, everything else begins to shake. The mind reacts quickly. It tries to regain control. It seeks reassurance. It overanalyzes. It creates urgency where there may be none. All of this happens not because love is deep, but because fear is active. Fear of losing the feeling, fear of returning to that empty space, fear of facing what has been avoided. And this is why clinging can feel so exhausting. It requires constant monitoring, constant adjustment, constant emotional effort. It never fully rests because it is always trying to maintain something that cannot be controlled. Love, on the other hand, rests. It does not need to watch every detail. It does not need to interpret every silence. It does not need to secure its place. It trusts the connection without needing to force it. This does not mean it is passive. It still cares. It still shows up. It still values the relationship. But it does not lose itself in the process. That is the key difference. Clinging loses itself. It becomes so focused on the other person that it forgets its own center. It adjusts, it bends, it gives more than it should, not out of generosity, but out of fear. Fear that if it does not, something will be lost. And over time, this creates imbalance, because when one person is holding too tightly, the connection begins to feel heavy. It begins to feel like something that must be maintained, rather than something that can simply exist. And that weight changes the dynamic. It creates pressure. Pressure to respond a certain way. Pressure to stay consistent. Pressure to meet expectations that were never openly expressed but are deeply felt. And when pressure enters a relationship, freedom begins to leave. This is why clinging often leads to the very thing it fears, distance. Because what is being held too tightly eventually seeks space. Not out of rejection, but out of natural balance. But the mind that clings does not see it this way. It sees distance as danger. It sees change as loss. It sees space as a sign that something is ending. And so it reacts again. More effort, more attention, more attempts to bring things back to how they were. But the more it tries, the more tension it creates. And the cycle continues. This is the silent pattern that many people live in without realizing it. They call it love. They call it deep connection. But underneath, it is driven by something else, something that does not feel safe on its own. Buddhist wisdom points directly at this. It does not reject love. It clarifies it. It shows that true care is not about holding on. It is about allowing the other person to be who they are without trying to shape them into what feels comfortable. Allowing the connection to change without immediately resisting it. Allowing moments of distance without turning them into stories of loss. This kind of care is not weak, it is stable. because it is not built on conditions. It does not depend on constant reassurance. It does not require the other person to behave in a specific way in order to feel okay. It stands on its own. And because of that, it can truly connect, without fear, without pressure, without losing itself. This does not mean the transition from clinging to love is easy. It requires seeing things clearly. It requires noticing the moments where fear takes over, the moments where the mind starts to grasp, to control, to secure. And instead of acting on those impulses, it requires something different. Awareness, the ability to pause and recognize what is happening without immediately reacting to it, because once something is seen clearly, it begins to lose its power. The urge to cling becomes just that, an urge, not a command. And in that space, something new becomes possible, a different way of relating, one that is not driven by fear. One that does not depend on constant validation, one that does not collapse when things shift. And slowly, as this understanding deepens, something begins to loosen. The need to hold on becomes softer. The fear of losing becomes quieter. The connection becomes lighter, not because it matters less, but because it is no longer carrying the weight of expectation. And in that lightness, something surprising happens. The connection becomes more real, more present, more alive, because it is no longer filtered through fear. It is experienced as it is, moment by moment, without trying to make it permanent, without trying to control its direction, just being with it. And that is where love begins to reveal itself in its true form, not as something to hold, but as something to experience, freely. And as that grip begins to loosen, something deeper starts to come into view. Because once the need to hold on to someone softens, another question quietly rises beneath it. Why did it feel so necessary in the first place? Why did certain people feel impossible to let go of, even when they brought confusion, distance, or pain? Why did small changes feel so heavy, as if something much bigger was at risk? There is a reason for that, and it does not begin in the present. It begins much earlier. There are feelings that do not belong to the moment you think they do. They show up suddenly, without warning, attached to someone who has only done something small, something ordinary. A delayed reply, a shift in attention, a quiet moment of distance. And yet the reaction inside feels anything but small. It feels overwhelming, it feels urgent, it feels like something important is slipping away. But when you look closely, what is being felt is not just about what is happening now. It is something that has been carried for a long time, something that has not been fully understood, something that has been waiting beneath the surface for a chance to be seen again. This is how old emotional wounds move through the present. They do not appear as memories. They appear as reactions. They do not say, "This is from the past." They say, "This is happening now." And because of that, they feel real, immediate, and deeply connected to the person in front of you. But the truth is, the intensity often comes from somewhere much older than the relationship itself. When a person experiences inconsistency early in life, when care feels unpredictable, when attention comes and goes without stability, the mind learns something very specific. It learns that connection is not guaranteed. It learns that closeness can disappear without warning. It learns that love must be held onto tightly because it may not stay. This learning does not always happen through clear events. It can come from subtle patterns, a caregiver who is sometimes present and sometimes distant. Moments of warmth followed by periods of emotional absence, a lack of reassurance when it was needed most. These experiences shape the way the mind understands connection. They create a quiet expectation that something good will not last, and when that expectation exists, the body stays alert. Even in moments of closeness, there is a part that is watching, waiting, preparing for change. It does not fully relax because it has learned that relaxation leads to disappointment. This is where attachment begins to take on a different meaning. It is no longer just about liking someone or enjoying their presence. It becomes about securing something that feels unstable. And when something feels unstable, the need to protect it grows stronger. This is why certain relationships feel more intense than others. Not because the connection is deeper in a healthy way, but because it activates something unresolved. It touches the part of the mind that has been waiting for consistency, for safety, for something that does not disappear. And when that part is activated, the experience feels powerful. It feels like importance. It feels like meaning. It feels like this person matters more than anyone else. But what is often being felt is not just connection, it is recognition. Recognition of a familiar emotional pattern. The mind is not just responding to who the person is, it is responding to how they make something old feel again. This is why someone who is inconsistent can feel more compelling than someone who is stable. Consistency does not activate the wound. Inconsistency does. And when the wound is activated, the mind becomes focused. It tries to understand, to fix, to secure. It becomes emotionally invested in a way that feels like deep affection. But underneath that investment, there is something else. A need. A need to resolve what was never resolved. A need to finally feel chosen in a place where choice once felt uncertain. A need to create stability where there was once confusion. And this need can become so strong that it shapes perception. It makes certain behaviors seem more meaningful than they are. It creates hope from small signs. It builds attachment not just to the person, but to what the person represents, because the person becomes a chance to experience something differently, a chance to rewrite an old feeling, a chance to finally feel secure. But the problem is, no one can rewrite that past from the outside. No matter how much attention is given, no matter how much reassurance is offered, the feeling does not fully settle. It may calm for a moment, it may feel better temporarily, but it returns, because it was never about the present moment alone. It was about something that has not been fully seen within. This is why reassurance can feel addictive. It provides relief, but only for a short time. And once it fades, the need returns, stronger, more urgent, more convincing. The mind begins to believe that more reassurance is the answer, that if the other person just stays consistent enough, attentive enough, present enough, everything will finally feel stable. But stability that depends on another person is always fragile, because people change. They have their own thoughts, their own emotions, their own fluctuations. And when they shift, even naturally, it can feel like a threat. Not because they have done something wrong, but because something inside is sensitive to change. This sensitivity is not weakness, it is memory, emotional memory, stored not as clear events but as patterns of feeling. And these patterns continue to operate until they are understood, until they are recognized as something separate from the present. Until the mind begins to see that not every reaction belongs to the moment it appears in. This is where awareness becomes important. Not to judge the reaction, not to push it away, but to notice it, to see when something feels bigger than the situation, to feel the intensity without immediately assigning it to the other person. Because once there is space between the feeling and the story, something shifts. The reaction is no longer automatic. It becomes something that can be observed. And in that observation, understanding begins. You begin to see how certain patterns repeat, how certain types of people create similar emotional responses, how certain behaviors trigger the same feelings again and again. And instead of asking, why is this person making me feel this way? A different question begins to form. What is this feeling connected to? And that question opens something deeper, because it shifts attention from the outside to the inside, from trying to control the situation to understanding the experience. And in that shift, something important becomes visible. The part of you that is still waiting for consistency, waiting for reassurance, waiting for something that feels stable. This part does not need to be fixed. It needs to be understood. because it has been carrying something for a long time, something that was not fully processed, something that was not fully held, and when it finds situations that resemble that old pattern, it reacts, not to create suffering, but to seek resolution. But resolution does not come from repeating the same pattern. It comes from seeing it clearly, from recognizing that the intensity is not always about the person in front of you, that the urgency is not always about what is happening now, that the attachment may be connected to something much older than the relationship itself. This recognition does not remove the feeling immediately, but it changes the way you relate to it. It creates space. And in that space, the need to act on the feeling begins to soften, because you begin to understand that not everything that feels urgent needs to be responded to. Not every fear needs to be followed. Not every thought needs to be believed. And slowly, as this awareness deepens, the patterns begin to loosen. The same triggers do not create the same reactions. The same situations do not carry the same weight. Because the mind is no longer interpreting everything through the lens of the past. It begins to respond to what is actually happening, not to what once happened. And in that shift, relationships begin to feel different, lighter, less confusing, less intense in a painful way, because they are no longer carrying the weight of unresolved history. They are experienced more directly, more clearly, without the same level of projection. And this clarity changes everything. It allows you to see people as they are, not as reflections of something you are trying to resolve. It allows connection to exist without the same pressure, without the same need to secure, without the same fear of loss, because the fear is no longer coming from the same place. It is no longer being driven by something unseen. It has been brought into awareness, and once something is seen clearly, it begins to lose its hold. Not all at once, but gradually, in quiet ways, in moments where you notice the reaction but do not follow it, in times where you feel the urge to seek reassurance, but choose to sit with the feeling instead, in situations where you recognize the pattern and allow it to pass without feeding it. These moments may seem small, but they are powerful because they break the cycle. They create a new way of relating, one that is not driven by old wounds, one that is not dependent on external stability, one that allows connection to be experienced without being shaped by the past. And in that way, something deeper begins to emerge, a sense of grounding that does not depend on another person, a sense of calm that does not disappear when things change, a sense of clarity that allows you to see the difference between what is happening now and what has been carried for a long time. And that clarity is what begins to free you, not from connection, but from the confusion that has been hidden inside it. Because when old wounds are no longer mistaken for love, something honest begins to take their place, something steady, something real, something that does not need to be held onto tightly in order to exist. And as that clarity begins to settle, something even more revealing starts to unfold. Because once you see that not every feeling belongs to the present, another question quietly rises beneath it. If it is not just the past creating this intensity, then why does the mind react so fast, so strongly, the moment someone pulls away? Why does a small distance feel like a sudden loss? Why does silence feel heavier than words? There is something deeper happening here, something that goes beyond memory and reaches into the very structure of how the mind holds itself together. A shift in someone's presence can feel like more than just a change. It can feel like something is collapsing. There is a moment that happens so quickly, it is almost invisible. A message is not replied to in the same way. A tone becomes colder. An energy that once felt warm becomes distant. And before any clear thought forms, something inside tightens. The body reacts first. The chest feels heavy. The breath becomes shallow. A quiet discomfort begins to grow, and the mind rushes to explain it. Something is wrong. They are pulling away. This is the beginning of the end. These thoughts appear so naturally that they feel true. but they are not simply observations of reality. They are attempts to restore a sense of stability that has been disturbed. Because when someone becomes emotionally distant, it is not just the connection that changes. It is the sense of self that begins to feel uncertain. The mind builds identity in subtle ways. It creates a picture of who you are based on how others respond to you. When someone is close, attentive, engaged, it reinforces a certain feeling, a feeling of being valued, a feeling of being important, a feeling of being secure, and over time, without noticing, this feedback becomes part of how the self is experienced. It becomes something the mind leans on, not as a conscious decision but as a quiet habit. So when that feedback changes, even slightly, the mind does not just notice the difference, it feels the loss of something it had come to rely on. This is where panic begins. Not because the other person has left, but because the internal sense of stability has been shaken. The mind is not reacting to absence alone. It is reacting to the disruption of a structure it was using to feel grounded. And because that structure was never fully seen, its loss feels confusing. It feels like something external has caused the discomfort, when in reality, something internal has been exposed. This is why the reaction feels so immediate. It is not processed slowly, it is automatic. The mind moves quickly to fill the gap. It tries to understand what changed. It searches for explanations. It replays conversations. It analyzes details. It looks for signs that confirm the fear because uncertainty feels unsafe, and the mind would rather create a painful story than remain in not knowing. This is how overthinking begins, not as a choice, but as a response to instability. Each thought tries to bring clarity. Each scenario tries to prepare for what might happen. Each conclusion tries to create some sense of control, but the more the mind searches, the more it finds reasons to worry, because when the mind is looking for loss, it will always find something that supports that fear. And this creates a loop. The more the mind thinks, the more it believes its own thoughts. The more it believes, the stronger the reaction becomes, until the feeling feels overwhelming, until it feels like something must be done. This is where behavior changes. Messages are sent with urgency. Attention increases. Effort becomes stronger, not from a place of calm care, but from a place of fear. Fear that something is slipping away. But this reaction, though it feels natural, often creates the opposite effect. Because when fear drives action, it brings pressure into the connection. It creates a sense of need, a sense of urgency, a sense that something must be fixed immediately. And this changes how the interaction feels. The other person may not understand what has shifted. They may feel the intensity without knowing its source. They may respond with more distance, not out of rejection, but out of the natural need for space. And this increases the panic, because now the fear seems confirmed. The mind says something is wrong, but what is actually happening is a cycle where internal instability leads to external pressure, which leads to more distance, which leads to more internal instability. And without awareness, this cycle continues. It repeats in different situations, with different people, in slightly different forms. But the pattern remains the same, because the root is not the person. The root is the way the mind has attached its sense of safety to something outside itself. Buddhist understanding points directly at this. It shows that the self the mind clings to is not fixed. It is constructed, built moment by moment from experiences, thoughts, and interactions. And when the mind believes this constructed self is solid, it tries to protect it. It tries to maintain the conditions that support it. It tries to avoid anything that threatens it. So when emotional distance appears, it feels like a threat to identity, not just to connection. The feeling is not simply, they are pulling away. It is deeper. It is, what does this mean about me? Am I still valued? Am I still important? Am I still enough? These questions are not always spoken, but they are felt, and the mind tries to answer them quickly, often with fear. Because fear fills the gap faster than patience. This is why emotional distance can feel so heavy. It touches something personal, something that feels like it defines who you are. But this is where a different kind of seeing becomes possible. When you begin to notice that the reaction is not just about the situation, but about what the situation means to the mind, something shifts. The focus moves from trying to control the other person to understanding the internal response. Instead of asking, why are they acting this way? A quieter question begins to form. What is being threatened inside me right now? This question does not look outward. It looks inward. And when you stay with it, without rushing to answer, something becomes visible. A sense of dependence, a reliance on external behavior to feel stable, a habit of using connection as a way to define self-worth. Seeing this is not comfortable because it reveals how much the mind has been leaning on something uncertain. But it is also freeing, because once it is seen, it can begin to change. Not by force, not by trying to eliminate the feeling, but by understanding it, by allowing the reaction to be felt without immediately acting on it, by noticing the urge to reach out, to fix, to secure, without following it automatically. This creates space. And in that space, something new becomes possible. The feeling is still there, the discomfort is still present, but it is no longer in control, it is being observed. And when something is observed clearly, it begins to lose its intensity, not all at once, but gradually. The mind starts to realize that not every shift in another person's behavior is a threat. Not every silence is a sign of loss. Not every change requires a reaction. And this realization brings a different kind of stability, one that does not depend on constant feedback, one that does not collapse when something external changes, one that remains steady even when connection fluctuates. This is where emotional independence begins to form, not as a withdrawal from relationships, but as a deeper grounding within yourself, a place where your sense of self is not built entirely on how others respond to you, a place where you can experience connection without losing stability when it shifts. And this changes how you relate. You no longer chase the same way. You no longer react with the same urgency. You no longer feel the same level of fear when distance appears, because the distance is no longer threatening the same part of you. The identity is no longer tied as tightly to the connection, and this creates freedom. Not freedom from caring, but freedom from panic. Freedom from the need to control. Freedom from the constant need to secure something that cannot be made permanent. And in this freedom, something unexpected happens. Connection becomes more natural, more balanced, more real, because it is no longer driven by fear. It is no longer shaped by the need to protect identity. It is experienced as it is, without the same level of interpretation, without the same level of pressure. And this allows relationships to unfold differently, with more space, with more ease, with more clarity, not because nothing changes, but because change is no longer seen as a threat. It is seen as part of the nature of connection, and when the mind accepts this, the panic begins to fade, not because distance disappears, but because the fear attached to it loses its hold. And in that quiet space, something deeper becomes possible. A connection that is not built on constant reassurance, a sense of self that does not depend on constant validation, a way of relating that does not collapse when things shift. And that is where real stability begins. And as that quiet stability begins to take root, another layer reveals itself, something even more subtle, something that has been shaping every attachment long before fear ever appeared. Because even when panic softens and reactions slow down, there is still a hidden thread running underneath most relationships, something so normal that it is rarely questioned. A single word used every day carries more weight than it seems. A word that feels harmless, even comforting, yet quietly binds the mind in ways that create suffering again and again. That word is simple, but its effect is deep. There is a moment so ordinary that it passes unnoticed when the mind turns connection into possession. It happens silently, A person becomes not just someone you care about, but something you begin to hold in a different way, not physically, but mentally. A label forms without effort, without intention, yet it changes everything. My partner, my friend, my person. It sounds warm. It sounds close. It sounds like belonging. But beneath that language, something begins to tighten. Because the moment the mind says mine, it creates an invisible boundary. A boundary that separates what is yours from what is not. And once that boundary exists, something else follows naturally. The need to protect it. This is where suffering begins, not at the moment of loss, but at the moment of claiming. Because claiming assumes something can be held in place. It assumes continuity. It assumes that what is present now should remain the same, should stay within reach, should not move in ways that feel unfamiliar. But life does not move like that. People change. Feelings shift. Circumstances evolve in ways that cannot be controlled or predicted. And when the mind holds onto the idea of mine, it resists this movement. It begins to expect stability where there is none. It begins to depend on something that is naturally uncertain. This is not a mistake of logic. It is a habit of perception. From a very early point, the mind learns to organize the world through ownership. It learns to identify things as belonging or not belonging. It creates a sense of control through naming, through categorizing, through defining. This process works in many areas of life. Objects can be owned, spaces can be defined, roles can be assigned. But when this same process is applied to people, something becomes distorted. Because people are not objects. They are not fixed. They are not static in their thoughts, their emotions, or their direction. Yet the mind treats them as if they can be held in a similar way, not physically, but emotionally. And this emotional ownership creates expectation. Expectation that they will remain consistent. Expectation that they will respond in familiar ways. Expectation that the connection will continue without interruption. And when these expectations are not met, the mind reacts. Not because something wrong has happened, but because something assumed has changed. This is the root of much confusion in relationships. The reaction feels justified because it feels like something has been taken. But nothing was taken. Something simply changed. The suffering comes from the belief that it should not have. Buddhist teaching points directly at this. It does not deny connection. It does not suggest withdrawing from relationships. It does not say that caring is wrong. It reveals that the problem is not in the connection itself, but in the way the mind relates to it. The problem is not love, it is the idea of possession. Because possession tries to turn something fluid into something fixed. It tries to freeze movement. It tries to create permanence in a world that is constantly shifting. And this effort creates tension. A tension that may not always be visible, but is always present. It shows up in subtle ways, in the need to check if everything is still okay, in the discomfort when things feel different, in the desire to bring things back to how they were. These are not random reactions. They are the natural result of holding on to something that cannot be held. The mind does not see it this way at first. It sees its actions as care, as attention, as investment in the relationship. But beneath that, there is a deeper movement, a movement that is trying to secure something, trying to make it stay, trying to prevent change. And this movement creates pressure, not only within the self, but within the connection. Because when someone is seen as mine, they are no longer just experienced as they are. They are experienced through expectation, through a lens that filters their actions based on what feels safe. This changes perception. It makes neutral actions seem significant. It makes small changes feel large. It creates meaning where there may be none. And this meaning is often tied to fear. Fear that something is slipping. Fear that something is no longer the same. Fear that what was once secure is becoming uncertain. This fear does not come from reality alone. It comes from the attachment to how reality should be. And this is why the idea of mine is considered a root illusion. Not because it is entirely false, but because it misrepresents the nature of what is being experienced. It suggests ownership where there is only connection. It suggests permanence where there is only change. It suggests control where there is only influence. And when the mind believes these suggestions, it suffers. Not because it is wrong to care, but because it is trying to hold on to something that cannot be fixed in place. This does not mean detaching from people. It means relating to them differently, seeing them not as something to keep, but as something to meet, something to experience in the present moment, without turning that experience into a guarantee. This shift is subtle but powerful. It changes the way the mind interprets everything. Instead of asking, "How do I keep this?" a different question begins to form. How do I be present with this? Presence does not require ownership. It does not require certainty. It does not require the future to be defined. It only requires attention. And when attention is given without the need to possess, something changes. The connection becomes lighter, not less meaningful, but less burdened. There is no longer the same pressure for things to stay the same. There is no longer the same fear when things shift. Because the experience is not being held as something that must continue. It is being experienced as something that is happening right now, in this moment. And this moment is enough. This way of relating does not remove care. It deepens it, because it removes the conditions that limit it. Care is no longer tied to outcome. It is no longer dependent on consistency. It is no longer shaped by expectation. It becomes something more open, more flexible, more aligned with the reality of how things actually move. This does not mean there will be no pain. Change can still be felt. Distance can still be noticed. Endings can still bring emotion. But the suffering is different. It is not amplified by resistance. It is not intensified by the belief that something should not have changed. It is felt as part of the natural flow of connection, and because of that, it passes more gently. The mind does not cling to it in the same way. It allows the experience to move, just as it allows connection to move. This is where a deeper form of peace begins to appear. Not a peace that depends on everything staying the same, but a peace that exists even when things change, a peace that is not fragile, a peace that is not tied to possession, and in this space something unexpected becomes clear. When you stop trying to hold on to people, you begin to see them more clearly, without projection, without expectation, without the need for them to confirm anything about you. They are no longer reflections of your needs. They are simply themselves, and this clarity brings a different kind of connection, one that is not built on illusion, one that is not maintained through effort, one that exists naturally without being forced. This is what happens when the idea of mine begins to dissolve, not completely at once, but gradually, in moments where you notice the tendency to claim and choose instead to observe. In times where you feel the urge to secure and allow instead. In situations where you recognize the pattern and let it pass without acting on it. These moments may seem small, but they are transformative because they weaken the habit. They create space. They allow a new way of relating to emerge, and over time, this new way becomes more natural. Less effort is needed, less control is applied. Less fear is present, because the mind is no longer trying to own what cannot be owned. It is simply experiencing what is there, fully, clearly, without needing to hold on to it. And in that experience, something deeper is found, not in possession, not in permanence, but in presence. A presence that does not grasp, a presence that does not resist, a presence that allows things to be exactly as they are. And that is where suffering begins to end. And as that grip of mine begins to dissolve, something unexpected comes into focus. Because once you stop trying to hold people in place, a quieter truth begins to surface, one that cannot be covered by closeness, attention, or even love from others. There are moments when everything looks fine on the outside, yet something inside feels distant, disconnected, untouched. And that feeling raises a difficult question. If people are still there, if care still exists, then why does it still feel like something is missing? There is a kind of loneliness that does not come from being alone. It does not depend on how many people are around you or how much attention you receive. It can exist in the middle of conversation, in the presence of someone who genuinely cares, even in moments that are supposed to feel warm and connected. It appears quietly, a sense that something is not fully reaching you, a feeling that even though you are seen, something deeper remains unseen. This kind of loneliness is confusing because it does not match the external situation. Nothing obvious is wrong. There is no clear absence, and yet the feeling persists. This is where the understanding must turn inward. Because not all loneliness is created by the lack of others. Some of it comes from the lack of connection within. There is a space inside that is often left unattended, not because it is ignored on purpose, but because it has never been fully understood. From early on, attention is directed outward, toward relationships, toward approval, toward finding connection in the presence of others. And over time, this becomes the default way of feeling complete. When others are close, the feeling of emptiness softens. When others are distant, it returns. This creates the belief that loneliness is something external, that it is solved by finding the right people, the right level of attention, the right kind of connection. But this belief only addresses part of the experience, because even when connection is present, the deeper feeling can remain. This is the sign that something else is involved, something that is not dependent on others, something that exists within. The mind is not always comfortable being with itself. Silence can feel heavy, stillness can feel unfamiliar. There is often a subtle urge to fill that space, to reach for distraction, to seek interaction, to avoid being alone with what is inside. This avoidance is not random, it comes from a lack of familiarity. When the internal world has not been explored, it can feel uncertain. There may be thoughts that are not fully understood, emotions that have not been processed, feelings that do not have clear explanations, and without clarity the mind prefers to look outward. Because the external world feels easier to navigate, it provides feedback, it offers distraction, it creates a sense of movement. But this outward focus comes with a cost. The internal connection weakens, the ability to sit with oneself without discomfort becomes limited. And over time, the sense of self becomes dependent on external input. This is where loneliness begins to take on a different meaning. It is no longer just about who is present. It is about how connected you feel to your own experience. When that connection is weak, even meaningful relationships cannot fully reach you, because there is a gap between what is happening externally and what is being felt internally. This gap creates distance, not between people, but within the self. And this distance is often misunderstood. It is labeled as being alone, as not having enough connection, as needing more from others. But what is actually being felt is a lack of presence within, a separation from one's own thoughts, emotions, and inner state. This separation does not happen suddenly. It develops over time, through patterns of distraction, through habits of avoidance, through the constant search for something outside to provide what has not been cultivated inside. And once this pattern is established, it becomes difficult to recognize, because it feels normal, it feels like the way things are. But there are moments when it becomes visible, moments when everything slows down, when there is no immediate distraction, when the external world becomes quiet. And in those moments, the internal distance is felt more clearly. This is often when discomfort arises, not because something new has appeared, but because something that has always been there is no longer covered. The mind reacts quickly. It looks for something to fill the space, a conversation, a message, a distraction, anything that brings attention back outward. But the relief is temporary, because the underlying disconnection remains. This is why some people feel a constant need for interaction, not because they enjoy connection, but because they are trying to avoid something else, something quieter, something less defined, something that requires a different kind of attention. Buddhist understanding brings a gentle clarity to this. It does not suggest removing connection with others. It suggests strengthening connection within, not as a replacement, but as a foundation. Because when there is a stable connection within, external relationships are experienced differently. They are no longer used to fill a gap. They are engaged with from a place of presence. This changes the quality of interaction. There is less need for constant reassurance, less pressure for the other person to maintain a certain level of attention, less fear when things become quiet, because the silence is no longer threatening. It is simply another form of experience. Learning to stay with oneself is not always easy. It requires a shift in attention. Instead of moving away from discomfort, it asks for a closer look. Instead of filling the space, it asks for stillness. This can feel unfamiliar at first. The mind may resist. It may try to create thoughts, to bring up distractions, to avoid settling into the present. But with patience, something begins to change. The discomfort becomes less intense. The silence becomes less heavy. The space that once felt empty begins to feel open. This openness is different from emptiness. It is not a lack. It is a presence, a quiet awareness that does not depend on external input. A sense of being that exists without needing to be filled. This is where a deeper form of connection begins, not with others, but with oneself. And as this connection strengthens, loneliness begins to shift. It no longer feels like something that must be avoided. It becomes something that can be understood, something that points toward where attention is needed, not outside, but inside. This does not mean withdrawing from relationships. It means engaging with them differently, without expecting them to complete something, without using them to avoid internal discomfort, without placing the responsibility of fulfillment on another person. This creates a different kind of presence in relationships, one that is not driven by need, one that is not shaped by fear, one that allows connection to exist without pressure, because the internal space is no longer empty in the same way. It is no longer something that must be filled. It is something that can be experienced. And this changes everything. The way you listen becomes deeper. The way you speak becomes clearer. The way you relate becomes more genuine. Because it is no longer filtered through the need to feel complete. It is coming from a place that already feels grounded. This does not remove all feelings of loneliness. There may still be moments where connection is missed, moments where presence is desired, but these moments are different. They are not overwhelming. They are not driven by a sense of lack. They are simply part of the human experience. And because they are not resisted, they pass more easily. This is the shift from loneliness as suffering to solitude as awareness. A shift that does not depend on changing external circumstances, but on understanding internal patterns. And as this understanding deepens, something becomes clear. You can be alone without feeling abandoned. You can be with others without losing yourself. You can experience connection without depending on it for stability. And in that balance, a different kind of peace begins to form. One that is not tied to presence or absence. One that is not affected by how many people are around you. One that exists within, steady and quiet. And from that place, relationships become something else entirely. Not a solution to loneliness, but an expression of connection that is already present. And that is where the feeling of being left behind begins to lose its meaning. Because there is no longer a place within that feels abandoned. And as that inner space becomes more steady, something else begins to reveal itself, something that often hides behind connection without being questioned. Because even when loneliness softens and the relationship with yourself becomes calmer, there can still be a quiet pull that returns again and again. A need that feels small at first, almost harmless, yet slowly grows into something difficult to ignore. It shows up in simple moments, waiting for a reply, checking for signs, looking for something that says everything is still okay. And when it is received, there is relief, but only for a while. There is a kind of hunger that does not feel like hunger. It feels like attention. It feels like care. It feels like wanting to feel close, wanting to feel certain, wanting to feel secure in something that cannot be fully guaranteed. And because it feels so normal, it is rarely questioned. But if you look closely, there is a pattern beneath it. A cycle that repeats itself in quiet ways, shaping how you experience connection without being fully seen. It begins with a feeling, a slight discomfort, not strong enough to be alarming, but noticeable enough to create a shift in attention. Something feels uncertain, something feels incomplete. It may not have a clear reason, but it is there. The mind responds quickly. It looks for confirmation, a message, a tone, a sign that everything is still as it should be. And when that confirmation appears, the feeling changes. There is relief, a softening, a sense that things are back in place. But this relief does not last, because it was not created from stability within. It was created from something outside. And anything that comes from outside can change. So the cycle begins again. The next moment of uncertainty arrives. The next need for confirmation appears. And once again, the mind looks outward to settle what is happening inside. This is the quiet loop of craving reassurance. It is not loud. It does not always appear as desperation. It often hides in small habits. Checking your phone without thinking, reading into messages more than necessary, feeling a shift in mood based on how someone responds. These actions seem simple, but they are connected to something deeper, a reliance on external signals to create internal stability. And over time, this reliance becomes stronger. Because each time reassurance is received, it reinforces the pattern. It teaches the mind that relief comes from outside, that safety comes from confirmation, that calm comes from being validated. This creates a subtle dependency, not on the person directly, but on the feeling they provide. And because that feeling is not constant, the need to maintain it becomes ongoing. This is where craving turns into something more complex. It is no longer just about wanting attention. It is about needing a certain emotional state, a state that feels secure, stable, and certain. And because that state is tied to another person's actions, it becomes unpredictable. The mind begins to watch more closely, to analyze more deeply, to search for patterns, because it is trying to anticipate the next moment of relief. This anticipation creates tension, even in moments where nothing is wrong, even when the connection is present. There is still a part of the mind that is waiting for the next sign, the next confirmation, the next piece of reassurance that everything is still in place. This waiting keeps the mind active. It prevents full relaxation, because the sense of security is not stable. It depends on something that can change at any moment. This is why reassurance, while comforting in the short term, often increases anxiety over time. It creates a temporary solution to a deeper issue. But because it does not address the root, the need returns, stronger, more frequent, more convincing. The mind begins to believe that more reassurance is the answer. That if it just receives enough confirmation, enough attention, enough validation, the feeling will finally settle. But it does not, because the problem is not the amount of reassurance, it is the dependence on it. No amount of external validation can create lasting internal stability, because stability that depends on something outside is always fragile. This is the nature of craving. It promises relief, but only delivers it briefly. It creates a cycle where satisfaction is always temporary, and because it is temporary, it leads back to the same starting point. This is why it is often described as an addiction, not in the dramatic sense, but in the subtle repetition of seeking something that never fully satisfies. Each time reassurance is received, it feels right. It feels like the solution. But when the feeling fades, the mind does not question the pattern. It repeats it, because it remembers the relief, not the fact that the relief did not last. This selective memory keeps the cycle going. It focuses on the moment of comfort and overlooks the return of discomfort. And because of that, it continues to seek the same outcome in the same way. This is where awareness becomes important, not to stop the desire for reassurance immediately, but to understand it, to notice when the urge appears, to observe the feeling without reacting to it automatically, to see the pattern as it unfolds. Because once the pattern is seen clearly, it begins to lose its hold. The urge to seek reassurance does not disappear instantly, but it becomes less automatic. There is a moment of pause, a space where you can choose not to act on it immediately. And in that space, something new becomes possible. Instead of reaching outward, attention can turn inward. Instead of asking, "What do I need from them right now?" a different question can arise. What am I trying to feel? This question changes the direction of the response. It shifts focus from the external source to the internal state. And when you stay with that question, something begins to reveal itself. A need for certainty, a need for stability, a need for reassurance that everything is okay. These needs are not wrong, they are part of the human experience. But when they are placed entirely in the hands of another person, they become difficult to manage, because they are no longer within your control. This is where a different approach begins to form, not by rejecting reassurance, but by reducing dependence on it, by learning to create a sense of calm without needing immediate confirmation, by allowing uncertainty to exist without rushing to remove it. This does not feel comfortable at first. The mind is used to resolving discomfort quickly. It is used to seeking relief as soon as possible, but staying with the feeling, even for a short time, begins to change the pattern. It shows the mind that the discomfort can be held, that it does not need to be fixed immediately, that it can rise and fall on its own. And as this understanding grows, the urgency begins to decrease. The need for immediate reassurance becomes less intense. The space between feeling and action becomes wider. This creates a different kind of stability, one that is not dependent on external signals, one that remains steady even when those signals are not present. And from this stability, the relationship changes. It becomes less about maintaining a certain emotional state and more about experiencing connection as it is, without constant monitoring, without continuous checking, without the same level of pressure. This does not remove communication. It does not remove care. It simply removes the need to use communication as a way to regulate internal feelings, because those feelings are no longer entirely dependent on the response. They are being understood, held, and allowed to move without needing to be fixed from the outside. This is where the cycle begins to break, not through force, but through awareness, not by denying the need, but by understanding its source. And as this process continues, something becomes clear. Reassurance is not the problem, dependence on it is. Because when reassurance is used as a supplement, it feels natural. But when it is used as a foundation, it becomes unstable. And recognizing this difference changes how it is experienced. It allows reassurance to be received without becoming attached to it. It allows connection to exist without being used as a constant source of validation. It allows space to exist without immediately filling it. And in that space, something deeper begins to form, a sense of trust. Not in the sense that everything will always stay the same, but in the sense that you can remain steady even when it does not. This trust is not built through external confirmation. It is built through internal understanding, through seeing patterns clearly, through staying present with discomfort without reacting automatically, through allowing feelings to exist without needing immediate resolution. And over time, this creates a different relationship with reassurance. It is no longer something that must be constantly sought. It becomes something that can be received without dependence. And that shift brings a quiet kind of freedom. A freedom from the need to constantly check. A freedom from the pressure to maintain a certain level of response. A freedom from the cycle that once felt automatic. Because the source of stability has changed. It is no longer outside. It is within. And from that place, connection becomes something that adds to your experience, not something that defines it. Something that can be enjoyed without needing to secure it. Something that can change without creating the same level of fear. Something that can exist without being constantly confirmed. And that is where the quiet addiction of reassurance begins to fade. And as that quiet dependence on reassurance begins to fade, another layer slowly rises to the surface, something even more hidden, something that does not always show itself directly, but quietly shapes the way attachment forms. Because when the need for constant validation softens, a deeper question starts to appear underneath it. What happens when the fear is no longer about getting a response, but about losing your place entirely? There is a feeling that many people carry but rarely admit, even to themselves. A subtle tension that appears when attention shifts, when someone else enters the picture, when you sense that you are no longer at the center in the same way. And in that moment, something inside reacts. Not loudly, not always visibly, but deeply. A quiet fear begins to form. The fear of being replaced. There is a part of the mind that does not just want connection. It wants significance. It wants to feel that it matters in a way that cannot be easily taken away, that it holds a position that is unique, secure, and not interchangeable. This desire often feels like love, because it is tied to closeness and importance, but underneath there is something else driving it. A need to be chosen, not just once, but repeatedly. A need to feel that among all possibilities, you are the one that stands out, the one that is preferred, the one that holds a special place that no one else can take. This need does not come from nowhere. It is shaped over time through experiences where attention felt conditional, where being seen felt temporary, where value felt dependent on performance, behavior, or circumstance. The mind learns that being ordinary is not safe, that being one among many is not enough, so it begins to seek something more, a sense of being irreplaceable. And when this need enters a relationship, it changes how connection is experienced. It is no longer just about sharing time or presence. It becomes about maintaining a position that feels secure, a position that feels protected. And because this position is not guaranteed, the mind becomes alert. It starts to compare, to notice differences, to look at how others are treated, to measure attention in subtle ways. This comparison is not always conscious. It happens quietly, in the background, but it shapes perception. It creates a sense of competition, even when none is openly present. Because the mind is not just experiencing the connection, it is evaluating its place within it. And when that place feels threatened, even slightly, discomfort appears. Not because something has actually been lost, but because something feels uncertain. The mind reacts to this uncertainty by trying to secure its position. It may increase effort, give more attention, try to be more appealing, more agreeable, more valuable in some way, all in an attempt to maintain that sense of being chosen. But this effort often comes with tension because it is not coming from ease. It is coming from fear. Fear that without this effort, something will change, that the connection will shift, that someone else may take that place. This fear creates a constant pressure, a pressure to remain important, a pressure to be seen in a certain way, a pressure to avoid anything that might reduce that sense of uniqueness. And this pressure changes the nature of the relationship. It introduces a subtle form of control, not always directed at the other person, but directed at the situation, at how things are maintained, at how attention is distributed, at how closeness is preserved. This is not control in an obvious sense. It is not about telling someone what to do. It is about shaping behavior in response to fear, trying to influence outcomes without directly expressing the underlying need. And because this need is often hidden, it creates confusion. The actions may look like care, like effort, like investment, but the feeling underneath is not calm. It is tense, it is watchful, it is constantly aware of where it stands. This is where attachment becomes tied to identity. The sense of self begins to merge with the role held in the relationship. Being important to someone becomes part of how you see yourself. Being chosen becomes a reflection of your worth. And when that reflection changes, even slightly, the sense of self feels affected. This is why the fear of being replaced can feel so intense. It is not just about losing a connection. It is about losing a version of yourself that was built within that connection. The mind does not separate the two. It sees them as connected. So when one feels threatened, the other feels unstable. This creates a strong reaction, one that may not always be visible, but is deeply felt. It may show up as jealousy, as insecurity, as a need to confirm that nothing has changed. But beneath all of these expressions, there is one central concern. Am I still the one? This question is rarely spoken directly, but it is present in many subtle ways, in the need to be prioritized, in the desire to be different from others, in the discomfort when attention is shared. These are not random reactions. They are responses to a deeper need, a need to feel that your place is secure, that your value is recognized, that your presence is not interchangeable. But here is where a deeper understanding begins to unfold. No one can guarantee that position, not because they do not care, but because relationships are not fixed structures. They are dynamic. They change over time. They evolve in ways that cannot be fully controlled. And trying to secure a permanent position within something that is constantly moving creates tension. Because the mind is trying to create stability where there is natural change. This does not mean that importance cannot exist. It does not mean that someone cannot hold a meaningful place in another person's life. But it means that this place is not something that can be fixed permanently. It is something that is experienced in the present, not something that can be secured for the future. When the mind begins to understand this, something shifts. The need to hold a position becomes less intense. The pressure to remain special begins to soften, not because the desire disappears, but because the expectation changes. Instead of trying to be irreplaceable, there is a movement towards simply being present. Being present without comparison, without measuring, without constantly evaluating where you stand. This does not remove care, it removes the tension around it. It allows connection to be experienced without the constant need to secure identity through it. This is where a deeper form of confidence begins to develop. Not confidence based on being chosen by someone else, but confidence that comes from within. A sense that your value does not depend on where you stand in someone else's world. That your worth is not determined by how central you are in their life. This kind of confidence is quiet. It does not need constant reinforcement. It does not depend on comparison. It exists independently of external validation. And when this confidence is present, the fear of being replaced begins to lose its intensity. Because the sense of self is no longer tied so tightly to the connection. It is no longer dependent on being the only one, or the most important one. It becomes stable on its own. And from that stability, relationships change. They become less about maintaining position and more about sharing experience. Less about being chosen and more about being present. Less about securing importance and more about expressing connection. This shift does not remove the possibility of change. It does not prevent someone from moving in a different direction. But it changes how that possibility is experienced. It is no longer seen as a threat to identity. It is seen as part of the natural flow of connection. And this creates a different kind of peace. One that does not depend on being irreplaceable. One that does not require constant confirmation of importance. One that allows connection to exist without the need to define it through exclusivity. This is where attachment begins to transform. Not by removing connection, but by changing the way it is held. From something that defines self-worth to something that is experienced without needing to secure identity through it. And in that transformation, something becomes clear. The need to be special in someone else's world is often a reflection of not fully recognizing your own. Because when you are grounded in yourself, when your sense of worth is not dependent on external position, the need to be irreplaceable begins to fade. Not because you no longer care, but because you no longer need to prove your place. And from that place, connection becomes lighter, more genuine, more free. Because it is no longer carrying the weight of needing to confirm something about who you are, it simply exists. And that is where the fear of being replaced begins to dissolve. And as that need to feel irreplaceable begins to loosen, something even more subtle comes into view. Something that hides beneath kindness, beneath care, beneath what often looks like deep emotional connection. Because when the fear of being replaced fades, another pattern becomes easier to see. A pattern that does not shout, does not demand attention, but quietly shapes the way people relate to each other. It feels soft on the surface, but underneath, it carries weight. There is a form of closeness that looks gentle from the outside. It looks like care, like support, like always being there for someone. It appears warm, attentive, even loving. There are no obvious signs of conflict, no clear tension, no visible struggle. And yet, something about it feels heavy, not in a way that is easy to explain, but in a way that is slowly felt over time. A quiet pressure begins to form, not because anyone is asking for it directly, but because something is being expected. This is where emotional dependence takes shape. It does not begin as something harmful. It often starts from genuine connection, from shared experience, from moments where being close feels natural and comforting. But slowly, without clear awareness, that closeness begins to carry a different function. It becomes a source of stability, a place where emotional balance is maintained, a way to feel okay. And when something becomes a source of emotional stability, the relationship changes. It is no longer just about being with someone, it becomes about needing them, not in an obvious or dramatic way, but in small, continuous ways that build over time. There is a quiet reliance on their presence, on their attention, on their ability to respond in ways that keep the internal state steady. And because this reliance is not always spoken, it creates something hidden, an unspoken agreement, an invisible expectation, that the other person will continue to provide what is needed to feel balanced. This expectation is not always recognized, it is not always expressed directly, but it is felt. And it shapes behavior. It shapes how attention is given, how reactions are formed, how moments of distance are interpreted. When the other person meets these expectations, everything feels smooth. There is a sense of ease, of connection, of comfort. But when something shifts, even slightly, the feeling changes. Discomfort appears, not necessarily because something is wrong, but because something is missing, something that was being relied on. And this is where the quiet pressure begins. The pressure is not always placed outward. It is not always visible in actions. But it exists in the space between two people. It is felt in the need for consistency, in the expectation of response, in the subtle tension when things are not as they were. This pressure can be difficult to notice because it is not aggressive, it is not forceful, it does not demand, but it influences, it shapes how the connection is experienced. And over time, it can become heavy for both sides. The person who depends may not realize the extent of their reliance. It feels natural, it feels like connection. But underneath, there is a constant need to maintain a certain emotional state. A need that depends on the other person's behavior. And because that behavior cannot be controlled, there is always a risk that something will change, that the source of stability will shift. And this creates anxiety, even in moments where everything seems fine, because the dependence remains. The other person may also feel something, even if they cannot name it, a sense of being responsible for more than just their own experience, a subtle awareness that their actions have a strong effect on the other person's state, that their presence or absence carries weight beyond what is directly expressed. This can create tension, not because they do not care, but because the connection begins to feel like something that must be maintained, something that requires careful attention, something that cannot simply exist without effort. And this changes the dynamic. What once felt natural begins to feel managed. What once felt free begins to feel structured, because the emotional balance of one person is tied to the actions of another. This is where emotional dependence becomes a form of silent pressure, not intentional, not aggressive, but present. And over time, this pressure can lead to distance. Not out of rejection, but out of the natural need for space. Because when connection becomes a responsibility rather than an experience, it loses its ease. It becomes something that must be handled carefully, and this creates a subtle form of burden, a burden that is not spoken, but felt. This is why it is described as silent, because it does not announce itself, it does not create obvious conflict, but it shapes the way the relationship moves. It influences how both people feel within it, and often it goes unnoticed until the weight becomes too much. The person who depends may feel confusion when distance appears, because from their perspective, they are simply caring, simply being present, simply staying connected. But what is not seen is how that presence is being used, not just as connection, but as support for something deeper. And when that support is not available in the same way, the reaction feels strong, not because the other person has done something wrong, but because something internal is no longer being held. This is where awareness becomes important. Not to remove care, but to understand its function, to see when connection is being used as a way to regulate internal states, to notice when the presence of another person becomes necessary to feel stable. Because once this is seen, something can begin to change. The responsibility for emotional balance can shift back inward. Not completely, not all at once, but gradually. Instead of relying entirely on the other person, there is a movement towards self-awareness, toward understanding what is being felt without immediately needing to change it, toward allowing emotions to exist without depending on external response to resolve them. This does not remove the value of connection, it strengthens it, because it removes the hidden burden. It allows the relationship to exist without carrying the weight of being a constant source of stability. It allows both people to be present without feeling responsible for maintaining something beyond their control. This creates a different kind of space, a space where connection can be experienced without pressure, where attention can be given freely, not out of obligation, where presence is shared, not used. And in this space, something shifts. The relationship becomes lighter, more balanced, more natural, because it is no longer shaped by dependence. It is shaped by presence. This does not mean there will be no moments of need. It does not mean that support is no longer important, but it changes how that support is experienced. It becomes something that is received, not required, something that is appreciated, not depended on. And this difference is significant because when support is required, it creates expectation. But when it is appreciated, it creates gratitude, and gratitude does not carry the same weight. It does not create pressure. It does not demand consistency. It allows for change without the same level of discomfort. This is where emotional independence begins to grow, not as separation, but as stability within, a stability that allows connection to exist without needing it to hold everything together. And from that stability, relationships become more authentic. because they are no longer influenced by hidden needs. They are experienced as they are, without the same level of tension, without the same level of expectation, without the same silent pressure. This does not remove closeness, it deepens it, because it allows closeness to exist without being shaped by dependence. It allows care to be expressed without being tied to internal regulation. It allows both people to be present as they are, without needing to carry more than their own experience. And this is where the silent violence of emotional dependence begins to dissolve, not through force, not through rejection of connection, but through understanding, through seeing the pattern clearly, through recognizing where reliance has taken the place of presence, and gently, steadily allowing that reliance to soften, until what remains is connection without burden, care without pressure, and closeness that does not need to be held tightly in order to exist. And as that hidden pressure of emotional dependence begins to dissolve, something else starts to stand out more clearly. Because once the need to lean on someone for stability softens, a deeper pattern becomes easier to notice, one that has been quietly shaping attraction itself. A pattern that does not follow logic, a pattern that often leads in the same direction again and again, even when the outcome is already known. There is a pull that does not make sense at first. It does not move toward what is stable, available, or consistent. It moves toward what feels uncertain, distant, difficult to reach. And even when there is awareness, even when there is understanding, the pull can still remain. There is something about certain people that feels familiar before anything has even happened, not because they have shown something clearly, but because they carry a certain energy, a certain distance, a certain unpredictability. And that feeling creates attraction. Not always calm attraction, not always peaceful connection, but something more intense, something that draws attention quickly, something that creates focus, something that feels important. This is where the pattern begins. The mind does not always move toward what is healthy, it moves toward what is familiar. And familiarity is not always comfort. Sometimes, familiarity is the repetition of something unresolved. When there has been inconsistency in early connection, when closeness has been mixed with distance, when attention has not been stable, the mind learns a certain rhythm, a rhythm where connection is not steady, a rhythm where presence and absence are intertwined. And over time, this rhythm becomes known, not consciously, but emotionally. So when someone appears who carries that same rhythm, who is warm at times and distant at others, who gives attention but not consistently, something inside recognizes it, not as a problem, but as something that feels real. This recognition creates a strong pull because it activates something that has been waiting, something that has not been fully understood, something that is looking for resolution. This is why the attraction feels intense. It is not just about the person. It is about what the person represents. A chance to experience something differently. A chance to receive consistency where there was once unpredictability. A chance to feel chosen in a place where choice once felt uncertain. But this chance is often an illusion because the pattern being activated is not created by the current situation. It is being repeated through it. The person who is unavailable is not creating the feeling. They are revealing it. They are bringing into awareness something that has been carried for a long time. And because it is now visible, the mind tries to work with it. It tries to fix it. It tries to change the outcome. This is where chasing begins. Not as a conscious decision, but as a response to activation. The mind becomes focused. Attention narrows. Other possibilities fade into the background because the emotional charge is strongest in this direction. There is a belief, often unspoken, that if this connection can be made stable, something deeper will finally settle, that if this person can become present, something inside will finally feel complete. But this belief is based on a misunderstanding. It assumes that the current situation holds the answer, when in reality, it is only reflecting the question of why this pattern feels so familiar. the question of what is being repeated, the question of what has not yet been fully seen. This is why chasing those who cannot stay often leads to the same outcome: distance, confusion, uncertainty, because the pattern itself is built on those elements, and no amount of effort can turn that pattern into something else. The mind may try, it may increase attention, it may give more, it may adjust behavior, all in an attempt to create stability. But stability cannot be forced into a dynamic that is not built on it. This creates frustration, because the effort does not lead to the expected result. The more energy is invested, the more important the outcome feels. And the more important the outcome feels, the harder it becomes to step back. This is how the cycle continues. The mind remains focused on the same type of connection even when it leads to discomfort. Because the discomfort itself has become familiar. It has become part of what connection feels like. And anything different may feel unfamiliar, even if it is healthier. This is where awareness begins to shift the pattern, not by changing the other person, but by understanding the attraction itself, by noticing what is being felt, not just at the surface level, but underneath. What is it about this person that creates such a strong pull? What feeling is being activated? What part of the experience feels known? These questions do not lead to immediate answers, but they create space. Space between the reaction and the response. Space to observe rather than immediately act. And in that space, something becomes clearer. The attraction is not random. It is connected to something deeper, something that has been present long before this specific connection. This recognition changes how the experience is understood. It shifts the focus from trying to make the connection work to understanding why it feels so compelling. And in that understanding, the urgency begins to soften. Not completely, not immediately, but gradually. The pull is still there, but it is seen differently. Not as something that must be followed, but as something that can be observed. And this observation creates a different kind of freedom. The freedom to choose not to repeat the same pattern. The freedom to step back without feeling like something essential is being lost. The freedom to experience the attraction without being controlled by it. This does not mean avoiding connection. It means recognizing when a connection is being driven by something unresolved, and choosing to respond with awareness rather than habit. This is where a deeper form of healing begins. Not by fixing the external situation, but by understanding the internal pattern, by allowing the feeling to be present without immediately trying to resolve it through another person, by staying with the discomfort without seeking immediate relief. This is not easy, because the mind is used to moving toward resolution, used to finding answers in the external world, but staying with the feeling creates a different kind of clarity. It reveals that the intensity is not always about the person. It is about what the person activates. And once that is seen, the connection begins to change. The same type of attraction loses some of its hold, because it is no longer being followed blindly. It is being understood. And in that understanding, something else becomes possible, a different kind of connection, one that is not built on inconsistency, one that does not rely on uncertainty to feel meaningful, one that does not require chasing to feel real. This kind of connection may feel different at first, less intense, less urgent, less dramatic, but also more stable, more clear, more aligned with what is actually present rather than what is being projected. This shift does not happen all at once. It develops over time, through repeated awareness, through choosing not to follow the same pattern, through allowing space where there was once immediate reaction. And gradually, the pull toward what is unavailable becomes weaker. Not because attraction disappears, but because the pattern is no longer being reinforced. The mind begins to recognize what is healthy, not just what is familiar. And this recognition changes everything, because it breaks the cycle. It creates the possibility for connection that is not shaped by past patterns. Connection that is based on presence, not repetition. And in that space, something new begins to form. A sense of clarity, a sense of stability, a sense of being able to choose rather than being pulled. And that is where the pattern of chasing those who cannot stay begins to fade. Not through force, not through denial, but through understanding, through seeing clearly what has been hidden within, the attraction, and allowing that clarity to guide a different path. And as that old pattern of chasing what cannot stay begins to lose its grip, another truth starts to rise, one that sits underneath every attachment, every fear, every longing to keep things exactly as they are. Because even when you understand why you run after what is distant, there is still a deeper pain waiting beneath that pattern. It is the pain of change. It is the pain of seeing that no bond, no matter how beautiful, can remain frozen in one perfect form forever. And this is where the heart resists the most. Something inside already knows that everything moves, yet another part keeps begging life to make an exception. There is a sorrow hidden inside every human bond, and most people do not notice it at first because the bond itself feels warm, meaningful, and alive. They feel the comfort of being understood, the relief of being close to someone, the softness of shared moments, and they naturally begin to believe that what feels good should continue in the same way. The mind takes a living experience and quietly turns it into an expectation. It says, this should last, this should stay, this should not change. That is how suffering begins long before any ending arrives. The pain is not only in losing someone, the pain begins the moment the mind demands permanence from something that belongs to time. A relationship is not a statue. It is not a wall built from stone. It is a moving thing. It breathes, expands, contracts, deepens, weakens, renews itself, or fades. It is shaped by seasons, by growth, by wounds, by distance, by new understanding, by disappointment, by maturity, by silence, by life itself. Yet the mind keeps wanting to preserve one version of it, usually the version that made it feel safest. This is why so many people suffer even while the relationship still exists. They are not grieving what is gone. They are grieving the fact that what is here no longer feels the way it once did. A friend still speaks, but not with the same warmth. A partner still stays, but the emotional tone has changed. A parent is still alive, but age has altered the closeness. A child still loves, but no longer needs in the same way. Nothing has fully ended, yet something has shifted, and the mind does not know how to bow to that shift. It keeps comparing the present with a past version that cannot return. It keeps measuring the current bond against an old emotional photograph. And because reality no longer matches memory, dissatisfaction begins to grow. Buddhist wisdom looks directly at this human struggle and says something both simple and difficult. Everything changes. Not because life is cruel, but because change is the nature of life. The teaching of impermanence is not cold. It is not meant to make love feel meaningless. It is meant to make love honest. It asks you to stop building your peace on the false promise that anything outward can remain untouched by time. This truth is hard for the heart, because the heart wants to rest in what feels beautiful. It wants to believe that if something is pure enough, deep enough, sincere enough, it will be protected from change. But no relationship escapes movement. Some grow closer, some grow quieter, some become different without becoming worse. Some must loosen in order for both people to grow. Some end in pain, some end with gratitude. Some remain but transform so completely that they no longer resemble how they began. The mind suffers because it confuses change with failure. It thinks that if a bond is no longer the same, something has gone wrong. But many relationships do not break because love was false. They change because life changes the people within them. A person who once needed daily closeness may now need space. A bond that once revolved around dependence may now ask for respect and distance. A connection built in youth may not survive adulthood in the same shape. This does not always mean something bad has happened. It often means reality is moving while the mind is trying to stay still. This resistance creates a deep inner violence. Instead of grieving naturally, the mind argues with what is. It says this should not be happening. They should still be the same. We should still feel the same. Things should go back. And because reality never obeys that protest, the person becomes trapped between memory and the present. They are no longer living the relationship that exists. They are mentally fighting for the relationship that used to exist. This is why the suffering becomes so exhausting. It is not only sadness, it is sadness mixed with resistance. Resistance is what hardens pain. A human heart can feel loss and still heal. It can feel distance and still remain open. It can even survive endings with dignity when it stops arguing with the law of change. But when it refuses to accept that every bond is impermanent, pain becomes identity. The person does not just feel hurt. They become someone whose whole inner world is arranged around the refusal to let reality move. This is where clinging becomes especially painful. Clinging does not love the living bond. It clings to continuity. It wants proof that what matters will remain predictable. It wants tomorrow to guarantee yesterday. It wants the emotional arrangement to stay in place. But no amount of fear can stop impermanence. No amount of control can protect a bond from change. Monitoring, pleasing, overgiving, chasing, explaining, sacrificing, waiting, resenting, none of it can turn a changing connection into a permanent one. At best, it delays acceptance. At worst, it damages the very bond it is trying to preserve. The Buddhist teaching does not say, do not love. It says, do not build your peace on what cannot stay fixed. That is a very different thing. To love with wisdom is to know from the beginning that the person in front of you is passing through time, just as you are. Their moods will change, their body will change, their priorities will change, their role in your life may change. Even if the love remains, its form may not. When this is understood deeply, a strange tenderness begins to appear. You stop demanding forever from each moment. You start meeting each moment more fully because you know it will not repeat in exactly the same way again. Impermanence, when resisted, creates fear. Impermanence, when accepted, creates reverence. That is one of the deepest shifts in Buddhist wisdom. Most people think acceptance of impermanence will make them detached, cold, or less invested. They fear that if they truly accept that all bonds change, they will stop caring. But the opposite is often true. When you stop pretending things will stay the same forever, you begin to care more honestly. You listen better. You appreciate more. You soften your pride more quickly. You become less arrogant in love. You waste less time assuming there will always be another chance to say what matters. The person who resists impermanence keeps postponing presence. They think the bond will wait. They think the warmth will always be there. They think they can return later with more attention, more honesty, more gratitude. Then life shifts, distance grows, something closes, time passes, and suddenly they realize they were living as though change were optional. Impermanence is not only about death or dramatic endings, it is happening in quiet ways every day. Every conversation disappears the moment it is spoken. Every stage of a relationship passes. Every version of you and the other person is already dissolving into the next one. The friend you had 5 years ago is not exactly the same friend now. The mother you knew as a child is not the same mother you know as an adult. The partner you first fell in love with is already changing, just as you are. Even the self that says, my relationship is changing moment by moment. To see this clearly is not depressing, it is awakening. When people do not understand impermanence, they become possessive with memory. They keep trying to preserve an emotional season that has already passed. They replay old closeness and compare it to present reality. They keep saying, we used to be like this. They keep trying to force the current bond to wear the clothes of the past. But life does not move backward. The spring blossom does not return by being pulled. The mind's inability to accept this creates bitterness. It makes the person suspicious, controlling, nostalgic, and resentful all at once. This is why some people are more distressed by gradual change than by sudden endings. An ending at least gives the mind a clear event to grieve. But when a bond slowly shifts, loosens, or becomes emotionally thinner, the ego feels humiliated. It cannot point to one clean moment. It feels powerless. It feels replaced not only by another person sometimes, but by time itself. It feels the insult of reality moving without its permission. And because it cannot control that movement, it either panics or denies what is happening. Denial is one of the ways people protect themselves from impermanence. They pretend the distance is temporary when it is becoming structural. They tell themselves the silence means nothing when the bond is changing form. They keep performing the same emotional habits while the relationship has already moved into another phase. Denial feels safer than surrender because surrender sounds like giving up. But Buddhist surrender is not defeat. It is clarity without violence. It is the willingness to stop lying to yourself about what is changing. This clarity does not always mean leaving. It does not always mean cutting ties. Sometimes acceptance of impermanence means allowing a bond to become different without punishing it for no longer being what it once was. A friendship may become less frequent, yet still remain sincere. A parent-child relationship may become less dependent and more distant on the surface while becoming more respectful underneath. A romantic bond may lose intensity but gain honesty. Impermanence does not only take away, sometimes it transforms. But transformation can only be seen when the mind stops worshipping continuity. If you only value what stays the same, you will miss the wisdom in how things evolve. This is one of the reasons spiritual maturity changes the way a person loves. A mature heart no longer asks only, "How do I keep this?" It begins to ask, "What is this becoming?" That question is softer. It is more awake. It allows reality to speak. It allows the bond to reveal its actual shape rather than forcing it into an old image. That is how compassion enters where control used to live. Impermanence also reveals the difference between appreciation and ownership. Ownership says, because this matters to me, it should remain available to me in the same way. Appreciation says, because this matters to me, I will meet it fully while it is here. Ownership becomes tense. Appreciation becomes humble. Ownership fears change as theft. Appreciation sees change as part of the cost of being alive. This is why Buddhism keeps returning to the theme of grasping. The issue is not that relationships are temporary. The issue is that the mind keeps trying to hold temporary things as if they were permanent. This grasping creates suffering not because human bonds are wrong, but because the way the mind relates to them is distorted. It wants certainty from moving things. It wants fixed identity from changing roles. It wants endless emotional security from another human being who is also vulnerable, changing, confused, and impermanent. No one can give you permanence because no one possesses it. Once this becomes real inside you, compassion deepens. You become gentler toward others because you stop demanding the impossible from them. You stop acting shocked that they changed. You stop treating every shift as betrayal. You begin to see that they too are moving through conditions they cannot fully control. Their mind changes, their fears change, their path changes, their wounds change. Just as you are not the same person from one season of life to the next, neither are they. This does not excuse cruelty. It does not mean accepting disrespect. Buddhist understanding is not passive blindness. It simply means that you no longer multiply pain by pretending that what changes has committed a cosmic crime. You can still set boundaries. You can still walk away. You can still mourn. But you do so without the extra suffering that comes from demanding that impermanence stop being true. There is also another side to this teaching that many people overlook. Impermanence is not only why things end, it is also why pain ends. The same law that changes relationships also changes grief, loneliness, fear, longing, heartbreak, and emptiness. The person who resists impermanence often resists it only when it takes away what they want. But impermanence also removes what they do not want. No emotion stays, no wound remains in the same form forever, no season of inner darkness is final. To understand impermanence only as loss is to misunderstand it. It is the law of movement itself. This makes acceptance more balanced. You are not bowing only to endings. You are bowing to the flow of reality. You are recognizing that all conditions arise, remain for a while, and pass. That includes intimacy. That includes distance. That includes joy. That includes sorrow. When this truth sinks into the heart, there is less panic in change. There is more trust in movement. Not trust that everything will go the way you want, but trust that clinging is not the answer. A person who deeply accepts impermanence becomes less desperate in love. They no longer try to squeeze certainty out of every interaction. They no longer read every shift as proof that disaster has arrived. They stop trying to turn the present into a permanent contract. Instead, they begin to offer their presence more cleanly. They can say, "I care," without secretly demanding forever. They can feel pain without turning pain into evidence that life is unfair. They can let a bond matter deeply while knowing it cannot be owned. This is a very different kind of strength. It does not look dramatic. It does not perform toughness. It does not pretend not to care. It simply remains open without illusion. It allows love without possession. It allows grief without collapse. It allows memory without trying to live inside it. It allows change without making every shift a wound to the ego. This strength is rare because most people only know two extremes. They either cling or detach. They either demand permanence or avoid depth. But Buddhist wisdom offers a middle path. Love fully and let reality move. Care deeply and do not lie to yourself about change. Receive the bond and do not turn it into an idol. Let the moment be sacred and let it pass when it passes. There is enormous peace in this, though the peace usually comes after the mind stops arguing. At first, acceptance feels like loss, because the ego hears impermanence and thinks nothing is safe. But eventually, a deeper intelligence begins to understand. Safety was never going to come from freezing life. Safety comes from learning how to remain present while life changes. Safety comes from loosening the grip. Safety comes from not building your identity on what cannot stay. Safety comes from intimacy with truth. And truth says every relationship is temporary in form, even when its meaning stays with you. A person may leave and still shape your soul. A friendship may fade and still remain one of the holiest chapters of your life. A love may end and still teach you how to see. Temporary does not mean trivial. This is one of the most healing insights of all. The mind often assumes that if something did not last forever, it failed or did not matter enough. But impermanence does not erase value. A sunset matters, though it disappears. A season matters, though it ends. A conversation matters, though it cannot be repeated exactly. Human bonds are the same. Once you truly understand this, you stop asking permanence to prove meaning. You begin to honor what was given, what was learned, what was real in its time. You become less obsessed with duration and more sensitive to depth. You stop saying it only mattered if it stayed. You begin to say it mattered because it was real while it was here. That shift frees the heart from a great deal of unnecessary suffering. It does not make endings painless. It makes them cleaner. It removes the poison of resistance. It allows grief to be grief, not a civil war against reality. It lets the tears come without needing to add the story that life has betrayed you. It lets a bond loosen without requiring you to harden in order to survive it. And perhaps most importantly, it returns you to the present. Because resistance to impermanence always pulls attention away from what is here. It either drags you backward into memory or forward into fear. Acceptance brings you back. It says, this is what the bond is now. This is what this moment offers now. This is what can be said now. This is what can be loved now. That is where life actually happens. Not in the version you want to preserve, not in the version you fear is coming, but here. When you live this way, relationships become less like cages and more like sacred meetings. You stop trying to lock people into roles. You stop demanding that every closeness maintain the same shape. You stop believing that change always means betrayal. And because you stop fighting the truth of impermanence, you suffer less each time life moves, which it always will. This is not the end of attachment yet, but it is one of the deepest cracks in its illusion. Because attachment feeds on the fantasy that what is loved can be made fixed. Impermanence breaks that fantasy gently but completely. And when the heart stops begging life to stand still, it begins to discover something quieter than possession and stronger than fear. It begins to discover how to love what changes without being destroyed by change. And as the heart begins to accept that no bond can stay frozen forever, another truth slowly rises from underneath that understanding. Because even when a person stops fighting change, there is still one more illusion that can keep attachment alive. A painful one, a very human one. Sometimes the suffering does not come from losing a real person as they are. Sometimes it comes from losing the version of them the mind created, protected, and secretly worshipped. And that is where the next layer of attachment becomes painfully clear. There is a kind of love that is not really love at all, at least not in the clean and honest sense. It feels deep, it feels intense, it feels meaningful, it can even feel sacred. But when you look closely, it is not always directed toward the real person standing in front of you. It is directed toward an image, a private version of them, a mental shape built from longing, memory, hope, and emotional need. This is one of the most painful illusions in attachment, because it can survive even when reality has already changed. A person may show you who they are again and again, but the mind keeps relating to who it wants them to be, who they used to be, or who it believes they will become one day. And as long as that image remains stronger than reality, suffering continues. The mind does this very quietly. It takes a few moments of warmth and turns them into a full identity. It takes one season of closeness and treats it as proof of permanent character. It takes one act of tenderness and builds an entire future around it. Then, when the person begins to show inconsistency, distance, dishonesty, confusion, or emotional limitation, the mind does not adjust easily. It holds on to the earlier image and waits for reality to return to it. This is the fantasy bond. It is not a bond with the living, changing person. It is a bond with what they symbolize, a bond with what they awakened, a bond with what the mind has assigned to them in secret. Sometimes they represent safety. Sometimes they represent healing. Sometimes they represent the love you never fully received. Sometimes they represent the future you wanted, the peace you hoped for, the missing piece you were tired of searching for. This is why attachment can feel much stronger than the relationship itself. The intensity is not only coming from what is happening between two people, it is coming from what one person has come to represent inside the other. A real human being is always complex. They are mixed, limited, inconsistent, evolving. They have contradictions. They have wounds. They have blind spots. They have moments where they disappoint. They cannot remain a symbol for long unless the mind keeps editing reality. And that is exactly what attachment often does. It edits. It highlights what fits the fantasy and pushes aside what threatens it. It remembers the sweetness and minimizes the coldness. It magnifies promises and excuses patterns. It turns fragments into proof. It says, this is who they really are, whenever something beautiful appears, and they are just confused whenever something painful appears. In this way, the fantasy stays alive, not because the person sustains it, but because the mind protects it. This is one reason people stay emotionally tied to those who are not truly available. The real person may already be showing their limits clearly. They may be inconsistent, emotionally closed, avoidant, self-centered, or simply unable to love in the way the other person longs for. But the one who is attached is not relating only to those facts. They are relating to the image behind the facts, the possibility behind the behavior, the imagined self that they believe is hidden underneath all the confusion. So they wait, they interpret, they give more chances than reality deserves, not always because they are weak, but because they are not grieving a real person yet. They are still protecting an image. The fantasy bond often begins early in a relationship. Very little may have happened in objective terms, yet the emotional significance becomes enormous. A certain look, a few deep conversations, a moment of vulnerability, a period of intense closeness, and suddenly the mind begins weaving a story. This person understands me, this person sees me, this person is different, this person could change everything. The speed of this inner storytelling is important to notice. It tells you that attachment is rarely based only on who the person is in reality. It is often based on how quickly the mind uses them to build meaning. The person becomes a screen onto which unmet hopes are projected. And once that projection forms, the real relationship becomes harder to see. You are no longer dealing with only what they do. You are dealing with what they mean to you. You are not just receiving their presence. You are filling it with old desire, old pain, old emptiness, old imagination. This is why the loss of a fantasy bond can feel more devastating than the loss of a clearly unhealthy connection should feel. What is collapsing is not only a relationship, it is a whole inner construction, a whole emotional architecture, a whole future that the mind had already started living inside. That collapse feels brutal because it exposes how much had been invested in something that was not fully real. It is painful to discover that what you loved was partly true and partly imagined. Painful to realize that much of your devotion was not to the actual human being, but to what they once gave you in a certain moment, or what you hoped they would continue to give. Painful to admit that you were waiting not only for them, but for what they represented in your emotional world. Sometimes they represented rescue. A person who arrives at the right emotional moment can quickly become larger than life, not because they are extraordinary in some objective way, but because they meet you at a place of deep vulnerability. If you are tired, lonely, grieving, starved for tenderness, confused about your worth, or desperate for relief, even limited warmth can feel like salvation. And when that happens, the bond becomes charged with more than affection. It becomes tied to survival. The person is no longer just a person. They are the one who made the pain stop, even if only briefly. That is a dangerous kind of meaning for the mind to attach to anyone, because once someone becomes linked to rescue, it becomes very hard to see them clearly. Their flaws are filtered through gratitude. Their inconsistency is softened by memory. Their emotional unavailability is explained away because the original comfort they gave still echoes powerfully inside you. But comfort is not always truth. And the fact that someone once soothed you does not mean they are who you believe them to be. This is where Buddhist wisdom becomes especially sharp and compassionate at the same time. It asks you to see things as they are, not as craving paints them. It asks you to notice how the mind creates suffering by preferring image over reality. It does not say that beauty was false or that tenderness meant nothing. It says the mind suffers when it clings to what was given as though it defines what is still true now. A person may have once loved you sincerely and still not be able to love you rightly now. A person may once have shown their softest self and still not be willing to live from that self consistently. A person may have awakened something beautiful in you and still not be your path. These truths are hard to accept because the fantasy bond does not live in the present. It lives in the emotional memory of what felt possible, and possibility is intoxicating. Many attachments survive not because the connection is truly alive, but because possibility remains unclosed. The mind says, but they could become this. Or maybe the person I felt that day is the real one. Or maybe if the timing changes, everything will open again. These thoughts keep the image intact. They keep you bonded to a future version of someone who may never actually arrive. This is one of the deepest forms of self-abandonment. You stop relating to what is true and begin relating to what is hoped. You stop asking, who are they consistently, and begin asking, who might they become if enough goes right? You stop responding to reality and begin negotiating with fantasy. This is exhausting for the heart because fantasy never fully satisfies. It offers emotional intensity without real ground. It keeps hope alive, but not peace. It keeps longing alive, but not clarity. It lets you feel connected to something beautiful while leaving you stuck inside uncertainty. Real love becomes possible only when fantasy begins to die. Not because romance must become cold or cynical, but because honesty must become stronger than projection. To love a real person is to allow them to be what they are, not what you need them to symbolize. It is to see the whole of them, not just the parts that support your emotional dream. It is to stop asking them to heal what they did not break, to complete what only you can face within yourself, or to become the final answer to wounds that are older than the relationship. This does not mean the heart becomes closed. It means the heart becomes sober, and sobriety in love is not the absence of feeling, it is the presence of truth. A sober heart can still love deeply. It can still feel wonder, tenderness, passion, devotion, but it no longer confuses intensity with destiny. It no longer assumes that being stirred means being aligned. It no longer treats emotional symbolism as proof of relational reality. This is especially important when someone represents something from your past. Attachment often forms around repetition, but not always through obvious pain. Sometimes it forms because the person resembles an old emotional promise. A distant parent you once wanted to win over. A warm but unstable caregiver whose love felt magical when it appeared. A family pattern where love had to be earned through patience, goodness, understanding, or self-erasure. When someone in adult life carries even a faint echo of that emotional pattern, the attachment may become charged immediately. The person is no longer just a present-day human being. They become an old door, an old story, an old chance to finally receive something differently. This is why the bond feels bigger than the actual relationship often justifies. You are not only loving them, you are trying to complete something through them, trying to get a different ending to an older wound, trying to make this one stay where another once left, trying to have this one choose where another once withheld, trying to feel safe now in the exact place that once made you ache. But when a relationship becomes the stage for unfinished emotional history, clarity disappears. The other person is pulled into a role they may never have agreed to play, and you, without noticing, become more loyal to the emotional script than to what is actually unfolding. This is how people stay attached to symbolic meaning even when the real bond no longer nourishes them. A person may be unkind, but they still represent the dream of finally being chosen. A person may be inconsistent, but they still represent the moment tenderness first entered your loneliness. A person may no longer show up, but they still represent the future in which all your waiting would finally make sense. The attachment is not being fed by reality anymore. It is being fed by meaning, and meaning can be more powerful than facts when the heart is hungry. That hunger must be understood, not judged, because no one builds a fantasy bond for no reason. The mind creates idealized images because it is trying to organize pain. It is trying to preserve hope. It is trying to avoid the shock of seeing that a needed source of comfort is limited, unavailable, or gone. Fantasy softens disappointment for a while. It keeps the heart from breaking open too quickly. But what protects you temporarily can imprison you over time. If the image is never questioned, you stay tied to what is not fully real. You keep waiting for evidence that your internal story was correct. You keep arranging your emotions around fragments. You keep explaining away what your deeper wisdom already knows. This is why healing often begins with a very quiet, very painful act: seeing. Seeing the person without the glow of longing around them. Seeing them without the old memory covering the present. Seeing them without the future fantasy editing what is here now. This kind of seeing is not cruel. It is compassionate. It allows both you and the other person to return to truth. You stop forcing them to be your healer, your savior, your lost home, your proof of worth, your unfinished answer. You allow them to be a human being, limited, changing, complicated, unable to carry what your fantasy asked them to carry. And at the same time, you return those missing pieces to yourself. The safety you wanted them to represent becomes something you must slowly build inside. The tenderness you hoped they would restore becomes something you must learn to offer your own life. The sense of worth you hoped their choosing would confirm becomes something you must discover beneath all choosing and rejection. This is where the fantasy bond begins to loosen. Not because the feelings were fake, but because the projection is no longer needed in the same way. You begin to separate the person from the meaning you placed on them. You begin to say, yes, they mattered, but they were not all that my mind made them into. That sentence is a form of liberation. It does not erase beauty, it restores proportion. It does not erase grief, it makes grief cleaner. Because now you are not grieving a myth. You are grieving what was real, and only what was real. This makes healing more honest. When people grieve fantasy, they often stay stuck for a long time. The mind keeps returning to what could have been. It keeps replaying the best moments as if they prove the whole story. It keeps bargaining with time. It keeps waiting for the image to come back alive. But when grief turns toward reality, something changes. You begin to mourn the actual limitations, the actual ending, the actual mismatch, the actual person. And reality, though painful, is easier to release than illusion. Illusion has no edge, no shape, no final form. It can keep shifting to protect itself. Reality is sad, but clean. This is why Buddhist practice keeps calling the mind back to direct seeing. Not because dreams are evil, but because attachment grows strongest where perception is distorted. The more clearly you see, the less your suffering is fed by what is not there. The more honestly you meet a person, the less likely you are to confuse emotional hunger with spiritual connection. The more deeply you understand your own longing, the less likely you are to make another person carry its meaning. And then something beautiful becomes possible. You can still love without fantasy. You can still appreciate what someone gave without turning them into a symbol. You can still remember the tenderness without building a temple around it. You can still let a person matter, even deeply, without making them the answer to your life. This kind of love is quieter, but stronger. It is not built on projection, so it does not collapse as violently when reality appears. It is not built on rescue, so it does not turn every shift into catastrophe. It is not built on the promise that another human being will heal your oldest wound, so it leaves room for truth, dignity, and freedom. And perhaps most importantly, it allows you to meet people as living beings, not emotional medicine. That changes everything, because when you stop loving the image, you finally get the chance to know the person. Sometimes that will deepen the bond. Sometimes it will end the fantasy and reveal that the bond was never what you thought. Sometimes it will bring disappointment, sometimes relief, sometimes sorrow, sometimes peace. But whatever it brings, it will be real. And reality, though less dramatic than fantasy, is where peace begins. The heart suffers deeply when it clings to representation instead of truth. But once it begins to see clearly, once it understands how attachment turns a person into a symbol of healing, salvation, completion, or return, a quiet freedom begins to open. You no longer have to worship what someone once gave. You no longer have to stay loyal to a version of them that appears only in memory. You no longer have to keep loving the promise of who they might become while reality keeps showing you who they are. You can bow to what was beautiful. You can thank what was meaningful. You can grieve what was never fully yours. And then, slowly, you can let the image fall away. What remains after that is not emptiness. It is truth. And truth, though it may break the fantasy, is the first thing that makes real love possible. And as the fantasy begins to fall away, another truth waits underneath it, quieter and more difficult to face. Because once you stop clinging to who someone represents, you are left with something most people spend their whole lives trying not to feel. The empty space beneath the chase, the silence beneath the longing, the part of you that no relationship was ever truly meant to cover. And this is where attachment reveals one of its deepest secrets. There is a kind of fear that hides behind attachment, and it is not always the fear of losing another person. Sometimes it is the fear of being left alone with yourself. Sometimes what feels like love is actually a defense against stillness, a way of keeping the mind occupied, a way of filling in a space so you do not have to enter it, a way of making sure there is always something to think about. Someone to want, someone to wait for, someone to decode, someone to chase, someone to miss. This is why some attachments feel impossible to let go of, even when they bring more pain than peace. The bond may be unstable, the connection may be confusing, the person may be emotionally unavailable, and still the mind keeps returning. It keeps rehearsing conversations, replaying memories, imagining outcomes, reaching for meaning. On the surface, it looks like longing for another person. But underneath, something else may be happening. The relationship has become a structure that protects you from your own inner silence. Silence can be deeply uncomfortable when a person has never learned how to meet themselves without fear. The moment external stimulation fades, old emotions begin to rise. Unprocessed grief, shame that was pushed down years ago, a dull feeling of not knowing who you are when no one is looking at you. A quiet emptiness that does not feel dramatic enough to be called suffering, but heavy enough to make you restless. Many people do not know how much of their attachment is really an escape from this place until the bond begins to loosen and they are forced to sit in what remains. That is often the moment panic increases. Not because the person was perfect, not because the relationship was your destiny, but because without that emotional fixation, something within starts coming into view. And what comes into view feels unfamiliar, unheld, and frightening. This is one of the reasons heartbreak can feel so disorienting. It is not only the loss of connection, it is the sudden collapse of distraction. The mind had a job, it had a target, it had something to circle around, it had an emotional story to live inside. Then the story cracks, and behind it is space. Too much space. Space where messages used to be, space where fantasies used to play, space where waiting used to give shape to your day. And in that unfilled space, you begin to feel yourself more directly than before. For many people, this feels unbearable at first, because they have not been taught how to stay with themselves in an honest way. They know how to seek, they know how to bond, they know how to overthink, they know how to distract, but they do not know how to remain present when there is nothing to reach for. So, attachment becomes useful to the ego. It gives it movement, it gives it drama, it gives it a sense of purpose. Even suffering can feel preferable to emptiness if emptiness threatens to expose a deeper crisis of self. At least when you are longing for someone, you know what to think about. At least when you are trying to be chosen, there is a direction for your emotional energy. At least when you are stuck in relational confusion, you do not have to face the deeper question beneath it all. What is left of me when there is no one to chase, no one to please, no one to miss, and no one to define me? That question is more unsettling than most people realize, because many identities are built through relationship, not only romantic ones. A person may know themselves mainly as needed, desired, chosen, helpful, central, important, rescuing, waiting, or wanted. When attachment dissolves, those identities begin to tremble. And if there is no deeper ground beneath them, emptiness appears. Buddhist wisdom does not treat this emptiness as a mistake. It treats it as a doorway, but before it becomes a doorway, it often feels like a wound. It feels cold. It feels exposing. It feels like meaning has gone missing. The ego does not understand sacred emptiness. It only understands lack. So when inner space opens, it immediately tries to fill it again with another attachment, another distraction, another emotional story, another person who can carry the weight of what has not yet been faced within. This is why patterns repeat. A person says they want peace, yet they keep entering bonds that keep them mentally occupied. A person says they want healthy love, yet they feel bored when things are calm and magnetized when things are uncertain. A person says they want freedom, yet they keep returning to emotional entanglements that consume their inner life. This contradiction makes sense when you realize that attachment is not always feeding on connection. Sometimes it is feeding on avoidance. Sometimes the suffering itself is performing a function. It is keeping you from standing still long enough to meet what lives underneath all the movement. Underneath attachment, there is often a relationship with solitude that has never been healed. Solitude is not the same as loneliness. Loneliness feels like lack. Solitude, when it matures, feels like depth. But to reach that depth, a person must pass through the fear that arises when external noise falls away. That fear can be intense. It can make ordinary stillness feel like danger. A quiet evening alone can suddenly feel unbearable. A phone that does not light up can feel like proof of worthlessness. A day without emotional stimulation can feel empty in the worst sense. What is being feared in those moments is not the absence of people alone. It is the absence of distraction from the self. Many people have built their whole emotional rhythm around not being fully with themselves. They wake up and check their phone. They fall asleep replaying someone's words. They fill silence with podcasts, music, scrolling, messages, fantasies, plans, conversations, and imagined outcomes. None of these things are wrong by themselves, but when they are used constantly, they can prevent a deeper encounter. They keep the inner world busy enough that its deeper content never fully rises. That content may include grief from childhood, buried anger, old humiliation, unmet longing, confusion about purpose, or a simple but painful lack of inner intimacy. To sit in silence without fleeing requires strength, because in silence the mind can no longer hide behind motion so easily. Attachment often becomes one of the most socially acceptable ways to avoid this encounter. It looks tender, it looks romantic, it looks emotionally meaningful. But underneath, it may be functioning like a drug. Not because the feelings are fake, but because they are being used to regulate contact with the self. The person thinks, "I cannot stop thinking about them because I love them so much." Sometimes that is partially true. But sometimes another truth is also present. I cannot stop thinking about them because thinking about them protects me from what I feel when I stop. That is a hard truth to accept. It can feel humiliating at first. No one wants to admit that part of their devotion is a defense. No one wants to admit that some of the intensity comes from avoidance rather than depth. But honesty here is healing, because it reveals why letting go feels so terrifying. You are not only losing a person or a fantasy, you are losing a shield. And once the shield drops, you must meet what was behind it. This meeting is where spiritual life truly begins, not when you learn beautiful ideas, not when you speak about detachment, not when you quote wise teachings, but when you sit in the room with yourself and do not run, when you allow the restlessness to rise without instantly reaching for a message, when you let the ache move through the body without turning it into a story about someone else, when you feel the emptiness and stay curious instead of panicked. This is not easy work. The first thing many people discover is that the emptiness is not empty at all. It is crowded. It contains old voices, old fears, old assumptions, old wounds. It contains all the feelings that relationships once helped silence. It contains the parts of the self that were neglected because there was always someone else to focus on. It contains the child within who learned to look outward for comfort because inward felt barren or unsafe. This inner meeting can bring sadness. A person may realize how long they have been abandoning themselves, how often they left their own body and mind to chase closeness elsewhere, how little time they have spent simply being with their own life without turning away. This sadness is important. It is not failure. It is the beginning of compassion. Because once you see how attachment has been used to avoid yourself, you stop judging your patterns so harshly. You begin to understand them. You see that they were attempts to survive inner disconnection. Imperfect attempts, painful attempts, costly attempts, but still attempts. And from understanding comes a gentler kind of change. You do not heal by attacking attachment. You heal by strengthening your capacity to remain present without it. That means learning to sit in silence for a little longer than before. Learning to notice the impulse to reach outward without obeying it immediately. Learning to feel loneliness in the body without turning it into a demand that someone must fix it. Learning to ask, what is here right now in me, instead of always asking, why are they not here for me? This shift changes the center of gravity. The emotional life stops revolving only around the other person and begins to revolve around awareness. Awareness is what makes inner emptiness transform. Without awareness, emptiness feels like a hole. With awareness, emptiness becomes space. A hole feels like something is missing. Space feels like something can finally breathe. This is one of the deepest differences in spiritual understanding. The ego fears emptiness because it experiences it as non-existence. But awareness begins to recognize that what feels empty is often only unoccupied by noise. It is not a dead place. It is an open place. A place where truth can arise, a place where the self can be met without performance, a place where desire does not have to be constantly obeyed. Many people have never known this kind of inner space. That is why they keep filling it too quickly, with another bond, another obsession, another emotional cycle, another person to save, to win, to decode, to wait for, to revolve around. The cycle continues until one day the suffering becomes greater than the avoidance. Then the person becomes ready, sometimes through heartbreak, sometimes through exhaustion, sometimes through spiritual hunger, to turn inward and stay there long enough for something real to happen. What happens then is not instant peace. First comes withdrawal, not only from the person, but from stimulation itself. The mind misses the emotional drama. It misses the highs and lows. It misses the hope, the fear, the checking, the imagining. This is why healing from attachment can feel so strange. Sometimes what you miss is not even the person as much as the mental occupation they provided. The whole nervous system had become used to that rhythm. Calm feels flat. Silence feels suspicious. Nothing happening can feel worse than pain because pain at least feels like something. This stage requires patience. You begin to see that your system has been trained to equate intensity with aliveness. And now you must teach it something gentler. You must teach it that peace is not emptiness in the bad sense, that stillness is not abandonment, that a quiet day is not a meaningless day, that being alone with yourself is not the same as being unloved. These lessons are not learned once, they are learned repeatedly through direct experience. You stay home one evening and survive your own company. You wake up without checking for their message and realize the world did not collapse. You sit with discomfort and notice that it rises, peaks and falls. You stop chasing stimulation and begin to hear your own thoughts more clearly. At first, those thoughts may be painful, but eventually they become more honest, more spacious, more kind. This is how self-intimacy grows. Self-intimacy is very different from self-analysis. It is not the endless picking, a part of feelings. It is the ability to remain lovingly present with your own inner life. It is the ability to say, "This ache is here," without immediately making someone else responsible for removing it. It is the ability to feel restless and not call it proof that you need another attachment. It is the ability to be touched by longing without building a whole identity around what is absent. Once self-intimacy deepens, relationships begin to change naturally. You no longer need them to drown out your inner world. You no longer need every connection to rescue you from stillness. You no longer fall so quickly into obsession when someone makes you feel briefly alive, because you are no longer starving in the same way. You have begun feeding yourself with presence. This is one of the most beautiful shifts in Buddhist practice. You stop approaching relationships as escape routes from your own mind. You start approaching them from wholeness, not complete perfection, not some emotionless state, but a deeper groundedness. You can enjoy connection without using it to avoid your own depths. You can miss someone without collapsing into panic. You can feel desire without turning it into a project of salvation. And perhaps most importantly, you stop making silence the enemy. Silence becomes a teacher. In silence, you begin to hear how much fear used to move your choices. In silence, you begin to notice the parts of you that need tenderness, not distraction. In silence, you learn that emptiness does not kill you. It reveals you. The self you meet there may not be polished. It may be wounded, lonely, ashamed, uncertain, and tired. But it is real. And real is where healing can happen. Attachment keeps many people away from this meeting for years, sometimes for decades. They remain always on the edge of themselves, always leaning towards someone else, always arranging their life around an outside source of emotional intensity. They call that closeness, but often it is exile from their own center. Returning to that center is one of the hardest things a person can do. It is also one of the holiest. Because when you can finally sit in your own life without fleeing, something powerful changes. You stop begging others to save you from your inner world. You stop turning every bond into a wall against emptiness. You begin to see that what terrified you was not a void waiting to swallow you. It was a room you had not entered yet. And once you enter it gently, with awareness, with breath, with patience, it does not remain a void. It becomes a place of listening, a place of rest, a place where you can feel pain without being owned by it, a place where you can be alone without feeling erased, a place where your worth is not dependent on interruption from outside. This is the beginning of a profound freedom, because when you are no longer terrified of meeting yourself, attachment loses one of its deepest roots. It can no longer control you so easily through the fear of inner emptiness. The silence that once felt unbearable becomes spacious. The solitude that once felt like punishment becomes clean. The self that once felt too difficult to face becomes familiar. Then relationships are no longer needed in the same desperate way. They become gifts, not hiding places. They become encounters, not anesthesia. They become part of life, not protection from life. And this is where the next transformation quietly begins. Because once you no longer need another person to shield you from yourself, you start to see more clearly how many emotions that looked dark and possessive were actually carrying something much softer underneath. Something wounded, something grieving, something afraid of being forgotten the moment attention moves elsewhere. And as that inner space becomes less frightening, as silence no longer feels like something to escape, another emotion begins to show itself more honestly. Because when you stop running from yourself, you also stop hiding from what you feel. And among all the emotions that begin to surface, one stands out as especially misunderstood. It arrives suddenly. It tightens the chest. It creates thoughts that feel sharp, uncomfortable, sometimes even embarrassing. It makes you compare. It makes you question. It makes you feel like something is slipping away, and most people call it jealousy. There is a feeling that people rarely want to admit, even to themselves. It feels uncomfortable. It feels small. It feels like something that should not be there, especially when you believe you care about someone in a pure way. But it appears anyway. quietly at first, then more strongly when something triggers it. A shift in attention, a new person entering the space, a change in how you are treated, and suddenly something inside reacts. The common belief is that jealousy is about possession, about wanting to control, about not wanting to share, about feeling threatened by others. But when you look deeper, something more fragile is often hidden underneath. Jealousy is not always anger, it is often grief, a quiet kind of grief that has not yet been recognized for what it is. It is the feeling that something meaningful is about to be lost, not necessarily in a dramatic way, not necessarily with a clear ending, but in a subtle, uncertain way that feels difficult to name. A fear begins to form, not always as a clear thought, but as a feeling that you are becoming less important, less central, less remembered. And that feeling carries sadness, because beneath the reaction there is a simple longing to matter, to be held in someone's awareness in a way that feels stable, to not be forgotten when attention moves elsewhere. This is why jealousy can feel so intense. It is not just about another person being present. It is about what their presence seems to take away, a sense of place, a sense of being seen, a sense of emotional ground. And when that ground feels unstable, the mind reacts. It tries to protect something that feels threatened. It begins to compare, to measure, to notice differences, to question where it stands. But these reactions are not the root. They are expressions of something deeper, a quiet sorrow that has not been fully acknowledged, a sorrow that says, "I am afraid of disappearing." This fear does not always come from the present situation. It often has deeper roots, moments where attention was lost, times where connection faded without explanation, experiences where being seen did not last. These moments leave an imprint, not as clear memories, but as emotional patterns. And when something in the present resembles that pattern, the feeling returns. Not exactly the same, but close enough to activate it. This is why jealousy can feel disproportionate, because it is not only responding to what is happening now, it is responding to what has been felt before. The mind tries to make sense of it in the present. It says, "This person is the cause." But what is being felt is often a mixture of present perception and past imprint. This mixture creates confusion, because the emotion feels real, immediate, and directed at the current situation. But its depth comes from something that has been carried over time. This is why simply trying to control jealousy rarely works, because it does not address what is underneath. It only tries to manage the surface, the comparison, the thoughts, the reactions, but the feeling remains, and it continues to return, because it is asking to be seen differently. Not as something to suppress, but as something to understand. When you stay with the feeling without immediately reacting to it, something begins to shift. The intensity softens slightly, not completely, but enough to observe. And in that observation, something becomes clearer. There is sadness there, not always obvious at first, but present. A sadness that feels like something is being taken away, or about to be taken away, even if nothing has fully changed yet. This anticipation of loss is what gives jealousy its edge. It is not always about what has already happened. It is about what might happen. And the mind does not like uncertainty. It prefers clear outcomes. So when something feels unclear, it fills the gap, often with fear. And that fear creates a story where you are being replaced, where you are no longer as important, where your place is being taken by someone else. This story may not be true, but it feels convincing because it aligns with the emotional pattern that has been activated. And once the story forms, it reinforces the feeling. The mind looks for evidence. It interprets behavior. It notices small details, all through the lens of potential loss. This is how jealousy grows, not just from what is happening, but from how it is interpreted. And interpretation is shaped by what is already inside. This is why two people can experience the same situation and feel completely different. One may feel calm, the other may feel threatened. The difference is not in the situation alone, it is in the internal landscape, the patterns that have been formed, the meanings that have been attached, the fears that have not been fully seen. Understanding this changes the way jealousy is approached. It is no longer something to fight, it becomes something to listen to. Not the story it tells, but the feeling it carries. Because the story may not be accurate, but the feeling is real. It is pointing to something, a place where security feels uncertain, a place where being valued feels fragile, a place where attention feels necessary to feel stable. These places are not weaknesses, they are parts of the self that have not been fully supported, and when they are activated, they seek reassurance, not always from others, sometimes simply from being understood. This is where awareness becomes powerful. Instead of reacting outwardly, attention turns inward. The question shifts from what is happening out there to what is being felt in here. This shift does not remove the emotion, but it changes the relationship to it. It creates space, and in that space, the feeling can be explored. Not analyzed in a harsh way, but gently observed. What does it actually feel like? Where is it in the body? What thoughts come with it? What fear is underneath it? These questions do not need immediate answers. They simply open the experience. And as the experience opens, it becomes less overwhelming, because it is no longer being pushed away or acted out immediately. It is being held, seen, allowed. And when something is allowed without resistance, it begins to move. Not disappear instantly, but change. The intensity decreases, the clarity increases. The emotion becomes more specific, less about comparison, more about fear, less about the other person, more about the internal response. And this clarity brings a different kind of understanding. You begin to see that jealousy is not always about wanting to control someone. It is often about wanting to feel secure, not through possession, but through connection. And when that connection feels uncertain, the fear appears. This does not make the fear disappear, but it makes it easier to work with, because it is no longer hidden behind reactions. It is visible. And when it is visible, it can be addressed in a different way, not by trying to eliminate it, but by strengthening the internal sense of stability, by reducing the reliance on external attention to feel grounded, by allowing connection to exist without making it the only source of emotional security. This process takes time, because the patterns are not new. They have been formed over many experiences. They are familiar. They feel natural. But familiarity does not mean they cannot change. It simply means they need to be seen consistently. Each time jealousy appears, there is an opportunity, not to react in the same way, but to observe, to understand, to respond with awareness rather than habit. And over time, this creates a shift. The same situations no longer trigger the same level of intensity. The same thoughts no longer feel as convincing, because the underlying pattern is being understood, not reinforced. This does not mean jealousy will never appear again. It may still arise in certain moments, but it will be different, less overwhelming, less controlling, more transparent, because it is no longer mistaken for something else. It is seen for what it is, a signal, not of threat, but of sensitivity, a place where attention is needed, not outward, but inward. And when that attention is given, something changes. The fear softens. The need to compare decreases. The sense of self becomes more stable. Not because the external situation has changed, but because the internal response has shifted. And from that place, connection becomes different, less reactive, less dependent, more grounded. Because it is no longer shaped by the same level of fear, it is experienced more directly, without the same need to secure, without the same need to protect, and this allows something deeper to form. Trust, not blind trust in others, but trust in your ability to remain steady, even when attention shifts, even when situations change, even when uncertainty appears. This trust does not come from reassurance. It comes from understanding, from seeing clearly what is happening within, and responding with awareness rather than fear. And that is where jealousy begins to transform, from something that feels like a threat into something that reveals what has been waiting to be understood. And when it is understood, it no longer needs to control the experience. It simply becomes part of it, passing through, without defining it, without shaping it, without holding it in place. And in that movement, something important becomes clear. The fear of being forgotten begins to lose its power, because you are no longer forgetting yourself. And as that fear of being forgotten begins to soften, another pattern quietly reveals itself, one that goes even deeper than jealousy, deeper than reassurance, deeper than the fear of losing a place in someone's life. Because even when you understand your emotions, even when you see your patterns clearly, there can still be a kind of hunger that does not go away. A hunger that keeps asking for more attention and more closeness, more proof, more feeling. And no matter how much is given, it never seems to be enough for long. There is a kind of emptiness that does not feel like silence anymore. It feels like craving, a pull that keeps returning, a sense that something is missing, even when something is already there. And this is where one of the most powerful images in Buddhist teaching begins to speak. There is a figure often described in quiet, haunting ways, not as something to fear, but as something to understand, a being that is always hungry, always searching, always reaching, but never fully satisfied. This is the image of the hungry ghost. The hungry ghost is not a creature in the external world. It is a reflection of a state of mind, a state where desire is constant, where fulfillment never lasts, where what is received cannot be held in a way that brings lasting peace. It is a condition where the mouth is always open, but the nourishment never reaches deeply enough to satisfy. This image may seem distant at first, but when you look closely at emotional attachment, it begins to feel familiar. Because there are moments where connection feels exactly like this, moments where attention is received, but it fades too quickly, moments where closeness is felt, but it does not settle, moments where reassurance brings relief, but only for a short time. And then the hunger returns, not because something is wrong with what was given, but because the need itself cannot be filled from the outside. This is the nature of emotional craving. It does not ask for connection once. It asks again and again and again, each time believing that the next moment will be enough, that the next message will finally settle the feeling, that the next interaction will create stability. But stability does not arrive, only temporary relief. This creates a cycle where satisfaction is always followed by another need, where fulfillment never becomes complete, where the mind remains in a constant state of reaching. This reaching becomes exhausting, not always in a visible way, but internally. A quiet fatigue begins to build, because the effort to maintain emotional satisfaction never ends. There is always something more to seek, something more to confirm, something more to secure. This is where the image of the hungry ghost becomes clear, not as something external, but as something that lives within the patterns of craving. It is the part of the mind that cannot rest, that cannot feel complete, that believes that the next experience will bring what the previous one could not. And because of this belief, it keeps moving, never settling, never fully arriving. This movement is not limited to relationships. It can appear in many forms, but in emotional attachment, it becomes especially intense, because connection touches something deep, something that feels essential, something that feels like it should be enough. And when it is not, confusion arises. The mind begins to question, why is this not enough? Why does the feeling not stay? Why does the need return? These questions are important because they point to something deeper than the surface experience. They point to the nature of craving itself. Craving is not satisfied by fulfillment. It is reinforced by it. Each time something is received, the mind learns that this is where relief comes from, and so it returns. But the relief does not last, because the craving is not rooted in the object. It is rooted in the pattern, a pattern of seeking outside what cannot be stabilized from within. This is why the hungry ghost is always reaching, not because it is lacking in effort, but because it is looking in the wrong direction. It is trying to fill something external with something internal, and this creates a mismatch. No matter how much is given, it cannot reach the place where the hunger originates. This is where understanding begins to change the experience, not by removing desire completely, but by seeing how it operates, by noticing the cycle, the moment of need, the moment of seeking, the moment of receiving, the moment of relief, and the return of the need. This cycle becomes clearer with awareness, and once it is clear, it can be approached differently, not with immediate reaction, but with observation. When the feeling of craving appears, there is a choice, not always an easy one, but a possible one. To pause, to feel the hunger without immediately trying to satisfy it, to stay with the sensation of wanting, without turning it into action right away. This creates space, and in that space, something becomes visible, the nature of the craving, how it rises, how it feels, how it moves through the body, how it influences thought. This observation does not remove the feeling instantly, but it changes the relationship to it. The craving is no longer the controller, it becomes something that can be seen. And when something is seen clearly, it begins to lose its automatic power. The urge to reach outward becomes less urgent. Not gone, but softer, more manageable. This is where the pattern begins to shift. Instead of feeding the craving immediately, there is a moment of presence, a moment where the feeling is allowed without being acted on. And in that moment, something important happens. The craving begins to pass, not completely at first, but enough to show that it is not permanent, that it does not define the experience, that it can exist without being satisfied externally. This is a crucial realization because it shows that the hunger is not endless. It is temporary, it moves, it changes, it fades. And once this is experienced directly, the belief that it must be satisfied weakens. The mind begins to understand that not every urge needs to be followed, that not every need must be fulfilled immediately, that there is another way of relating to desire, a way that does not create constant dependency. This does not mean rejecting connection. It means changing how connection is used. Instead of using it to fill a continuous hunger, it becomes something that is experienced without the same level of attachment, something that can be enjoyed without needing to complete something. This changes the quality of the experience. It becomes lighter, less pressured, less driven by the need to maintain a certain feeling, because the feeling is no longer being forced to stay. It is allowed to come and go, just like everything else. This is where the teaching of the hungry ghost becomes a form of insight rather than a warning. It shows how the mind can become trapped in a cycle of endless seeking. But it also shows how that cycle can be seen, and once it is seen, it can begin to loosen, not through force, but through understanding, through presence, through the willingness to stay with what is felt, rather than immediately trying to change it. This willingness creates a different kind of stability, one that does not depend on constant input, one that does not require continuous reassurance, one that is not driven by the same level of craving. And from that stability, something else becomes possible: contentment, not a dramatic or overwhelming feeling, but a quiet sense of enough. A sense that what is present is sufficient, that there is no immediate need to seek more, that the moment does not need to be improved. This contentment is not created by having everything. It is created by not needing everything to feel complete. And this is where the hunger begins to fade, not because desire disappears completely, but because it is no longer the center of the experience. It becomes one part of the whole, not the driving force, not the defining feature, just something that arises and passes. And in that movement, something important becomes clear. The endless craving was never about the external world. It was about how the mind related to it. And once that relationship changes, the experience changes. The hunger softens, the reaching slows, the need to constantly fill the space decreases, and in its place, something quieter appears. A sense of being, not needing to become something else, not needing to acquire something more, just being present with what is. And that is where the hungry ghost begins to lose its hold, because it is no longer being fed in the same way. And without that constant feeding, the pattern begins to dissolve, leaving behind something simpler, something steadier, something that does not depend on endless craving to exist. And as that endless hunger begins to quiet, as the need to constantly reach starts to lose its urgency, another pattern comes into view, one that is even more subtle, even more hidden beneath the surface. Because when craving softens, what remains is not always peace right away. Sometimes what remains is fear, a quieter fear, a deeper one. The fear that what is here may not stay. There is a moment that most people do not notice clearly, a moment where care begins to shift into something else. It does not happen loudly. It does not announce itself as control. It begins as concern, as attention, as a desire to keep something meaningful safe. But slowly, without clear awareness, that desire begins to tighten. It becomes less about connection and more about preventing loss. This is how fear of separation begins to shape behavior. At first, it feels natural. You want to stay close. You want to maintain what feels good. You want to make sure nothing goes wrong. But beneath that, something else is happening. The mind is trying to secure something that cannot be secured. And in that effort, it begins to act, not always in obvious ways, but in small, consistent patterns. It starts to monitor, to pay closer attention than before, to notice changes in tone, timing, energy, to read into silence, to look for meaning in details that once passed without concern. This monitoring does not feel like control. It feels like awareness, like being attentive, like caring deeply, but the feeling underneath is not calm. It is watchful, it is alert, it is scanning for signs. Signs that everything is still okay, signs that nothing is slipping, signs that the connection is still secure. This creates a subtle tension, because the mind is no longer resting in the connection, it is guarding it. And guarding requires effort. It requires constant attention. It requires interpreting signals. It requires staying one step ahead of possible change. This is how fear turns into control without being recognized as such. Control does not always look like forcing someone to act a certain way. Sometimes it looks like adjusting your own behavior to influence outcomes, to prevent distance, to maintain closeness, to avoid anything that might lead to separation. This is where overgiving begins, giving more attention, more care, more effort, not always from a place of generosity, but from a place of fear. A quiet belief that if you give enough, if you show enough, if you stay present enough, nothing will change. This belief feels convincing, because giving creates connection. But when giving is driven by fear, it carries pressure. It is no longer free. It becomes a strategy, a way to secure something, and this changes the energy of the interaction. The other person may feel the weight of it, even if they cannot explain why, because what is being offered is not just care, it is expectation, an expectation that the connection will be maintained in return. This expectation is rarely spoken, but it is felt. It creates an invisible contract, a sense that something must be preserved, that something must not change. And this is where pleasing begins, trying to avoid conflict, trying to maintain harmony, trying to be what the other person needs, not always because it feels right, but because it feels necessary. Necessary to keep the connection stable, necessary to prevent distance, necessary to avoid loss. This pattern can become so natural that it is not questioned. It feels like being considerate, like being understanding, like being flexible. But underneath, there is a quiet tension, a sense that you are adjusting yourself to maintain something, and over time, this adjustment can lead to disconnection from your own needs, because attention is focused outward, on what will keep things steady, on what will prevent change, on what will ensure closeness. This is where manipulation can appear, not in an obvious or harmful way, but in subtle forms, trying to guide the interaction, trying to influence how the other person responds, trying to create outcomes that feel safe. This may look like choosing words carefully to get a certain reaction, or holding back feelings to avoid pushing someone away, or creating situations that increase closeness. These actions are not always intentional, but they are shaped by fear. Fear that if things are left to unfold naturally, something may change, and that change may lead to separation. This is the core of the pattern. The belief that control can prevent loss, that careful behavior can secure permanence, that enough effort can keep everything the same. But this belief does not match reality, because connection is not something that can be fixed in place. It moves, it changes, it evolves, and no amount of control can stop that movement. What control does is create tension. It makes the connection feel managed, less natural, less free. Because it is no longer allowed to move on its own, it is being guided, shaped, influenced. And over time, this creates imbalance. One person is trying to maintain stability, the other may feel that pressure, even if it is not expressed directly. This can lead to distance, not because the connection is not valued, but because it no longer feels effortless. It feels like something that must be maintained carefully, and this increases the fear, because the very thing that was being avoided begins to appear. Distance, change, uncertainty. This is how the cycle reinforces itself. Fear leads to control. Control creates pressure. Pressure leads to distance. Distance increases fear, and the pattern continues. Breaking this cycle requires something different, not more effort, not better strategies, but awareness. The ability to see when behavior is being driven by fear, to notice the moments where attention becomes control, where care becomes pressure, where giving becomes a way to secure. This awareness does not require immediate change. It begins with recognition, seeing the pattern as it happens, feeling the tension in the body, noticing the thoughts that drive the behavior. And in that recognition, something shifts. The behavior is no longer automatic, it becomes visible. And once something is visible, it can be approached differently. Instead of acting immediately, there is a pause, a moment where the feeling can be felt without reacting, where the urge to control can be observed. This creates space. And in that space, a different response becomes possible, not one driven by fear, but one grounded in presence. This does not mean ignoring the need for connection. It means allowing connection to exist without trying to fix it in place, allowing it to move, to change, to unfold naturally. This requires trust, not in the sense that everything will stay the same, but in the sense that you can remain steady even when it does not. This trust reduces the need for control, because stability is no longer dependent on external conditions. It is developed internally, through understanding, through presence, through the ability to stay with uncertainty without immediately trying to remove it. This changes how connection is experienced. It becomes less about maintaining a certain state and more about being with what is, without forcing it, without shaping it, without trying to guarantee its outcome. This does not remove care, it refines it. It allows care to exist without the weight of expectation, without the pressure to secure permanence, without the need to control the flow of the relationship. And from this place, something becomes clearer. The fear of separation was not about the other person alone. It was about the need for stability, a need that was placed outside. And once that need is brought back inward, the pattern begins to change. Control softens, monitoring decreases, overgiving becomes more balanced, pleasing becomes less necessary. Because the connection is no longer being used to maintain internal stability. It is being experienced as part of life, not the foundation of it. And in that shift, something important happens. The connection becomes more real, less shaped by fear, less influenced by control, more aligned with what is actually present. And that is where the fear of separation begins to lose its power. Because you are no longer trying to hold everything together, you are allowing it to be. What you once called love begins to look different now, not weaker, but clearer, not less meaningful, but more honest. Because what felt like attachment was never just about another person. It was about fear. The fear of being left, forgotten, replaced, unseen or alone with a part of yourself you never learned how to face. It was the mind trying to hold on, trying to control, trying to secure something that was never meant to stay the same. You saw how love becomes clinging when it demands reassurance instead of offering freedom. You saw how old wounds quietly disguise themselves as deep connection. You saw how the mind panics, not because someone is leaving, but because identity feels like it is collapsing. You saw how the illusion of mine creates suffering the moment it appears. You saw how loneliness can exist even in the presence of love, because the deeper separation is within. You saw the craving that never ends, the silent pressure of emotional dependence, the pull toward those who cannot stay, and the painful truth that everything changes, no matter how much it matters. You saw how the mind creates fantasy bonds, how it uses people to escape inner emptiness, how jealousy hides grief, how the hungry ghost keeps asking for more, and how fear turns love into control without you noticing. You saw how even being needed can become a form of attachment, and how easily the heart can confuse usefulness with worth. And now something begins to shift. Because the more you see, the less you cling. The more you understand, the less you fear. The more you return to yourself, the less you need others to complete you. This is not about losing love. This is about freeing it. So here is something to sit with tonight. What have you been holding on to? Not because it is right for you, but because you are afraid of what you will feel if you let it go. Write it in the comments as one word. Just one word. No explanation, no story. Let that word be your truth. And if something in this message spoke to you, if you felt even a small shift inside, then subscribe to the channel. Because this is not just content, this is a path back to yourself. And the deeper you walk it, the less you will ever need to hold on again.